Welcome to this webinar on working with suicidal clients. And my name is Professor Andrew Reeves, and I'm a British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy Senior Accredited Counsellor Psychotherapist, a Senior Accredited Coach, and a Registered Social Worker. And today's webinar is going to look at some of the things that we as practitioners across the board, as therapists, maybe as social workers, as other mental health practitioners, just need to keep in mind when we're undertaking some work with clients who present at suicide risk. What it doesn't do is give definitive answers about you should definitely do this and you should definitely do that in response to particular situations. And therein, I think, lies one of the difficulties we face as practitioners, in that a lot of what we do is ultimately about sitting with uncertainty and sitting with the not knowing, and finding ways in which we can create kind of meaning-making opportunities for our clients to make sense of their experience and their experience of suicidality. So I've explained a little bit about my professional roles. I've been working in the field for just around about 40 years. I started off as a Samaritan's volunteer, which is a helpline for people experiencing kind of suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts, or indeed suicidal intent, before training as a social worker, and then as a therapist, and now as a therapist and coach and as an academic. And working with suicide has touched me in all sorts of ways, which I'll talk about a little bit as we go on. But I have some slides that we can work through to help you think about your work and your practice with suicidal clients. So I called it tightropes and safety nets, and I've called it that for a reason, because for me, that's what it feels like. It feels that working with somebody in a helping context, in a therapy context, is it's like walking a tightrope, because we're doing the best we can. We're trying to keep our professional and indeed our personal balance. But it can feel really precarious. It can feel that we might fall or slip at any given point. And the safety nets, of course, are the things that we can put in place to help safeguard our practice, safeguard ourselves, and indeed safeguard our clients. So suddenly, with appropriate support and mitigating factors to catch us if we should fall, the tightrope might feel a little less precarious. Before I start, however, I just wanted to flag obviously the title of the workshop indicates that we're going to be talking about suicide in a therapeutic context. And by therapeutic, I'm meaning in a fairly broad sense. There's nothing in the session that is intended to provoke difficult feelings for you, but be aware that feelings might be around for you. And please, feel free to pause the webinar, to take a bit of time out, just to reflect on your own responses, not only to look after your well-being, but also to create those kind of reflective and reflexive opportunities to try and assimilate and think about what does and doesn't work for you. There'll be things that I say that you agree with. There'll be things that I say that resonate with you. There might be things that I say that will leave you shouting at the screen because you profoundly disagree with me. And all of those responses are absolutely okay. And what I encourage you to do is kind of think about and make your best sense of them as we go along. So the point of the webinar is to in its broadest sense, to help you think about risk in the therapeutic context. And we'll start by unpacking that a little bit more, because risk has become real parlance in the mental health discourse. And I think we need to unpack it a little bit and think about our attitude and understanding to risk as a gateway to help us think about the therapeutic work. Because what I'm going to be suggesting is the key aspects of the therapeutic work ultimately sit in the relationship and sit in our experience of the person we're working with and the person's experience of us. So how we can situate ourselves in the relationship to undertake a real exploration of the individual's thoughts around suicide, and indeed, in doing that, how you can draw on their own resources for safety planning. There's an important caveat in saying that. The things I'm talking about mostly in this workshop are assuming that somebody has capacity to engage with that work. And by capacity, I'm meaning very specifically, in some regions it's used as a legal term, in other regions it's used as an advisory term. But that ability of the client to be able to engage with the dialogue, to understand the dialogue, to make sense of what's being said, to be able to articulate their own thoughts and feelings, to remember the information long enough to do so, to be able to communicate that back, and ultimately to make informed decisions about their own well-being. In some regions, in some territories, suicide is still deemed as illegal. I'm based in the UK. From a UK context, suicide isn't illegal, so people have the right under law to end their life through suicide. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's any easier for us to contend with. So to think about how we might use resources, drawing on the client's cultural resources to develop maybe keep safe resources to help us undertake that work a bit more. So by the end of this webinar, what is it I hope that you will be able to do? And you might be able to do these things already and just revisit them as a reflective opportunity for your existing practice, or some ideas might be new to you. The hope is that you'll be able to think about what risk means to you more broadly than the very narrow definitions, I would argue, are currently doing the rounds in mental health, and think where suicide sits into relation to those. To be able to think more explicitly about the relational factors that will inform our work, because again, it's the relationship where the work will happen, and it's the relationship where the safety for the client will emerge. And to be able to think about what those factors might be, and indeed what aspects of the relationship might hinder our work with suicide. Drawing on a client's resources is absolutely critical. My training has been in psychodynamic work, in cognitive behavioral, and indeed in humanistic as a person-centered practitioner. I would now define my practice as kind of integrative, pluralistic, which I mean that people need different things at different times, and different people need different things at different times. And so there is no single blueprint for working with suicide risk. There are the nuances of the work that we do that we have to navigate as explicitly as possible while drawing on the client's, what a pluralist will call the client's cultural resources. Cultural with a small c, so those aspects of themselves that they use to draw on to keep themselves safe, what we might deem as their individual protective factors, but also cultural with a large C, you know, where people are situated in relation to themselves, their community, their family, their systems, their faith, their spirituality, their broader cultural reference points that can be both facilitative and hindering in keeping people safe, and how that keep safe plan can be used in a bespoke way. That's what we're hoping to achieve in the webinar today. To do that, there'll be several points during the webinar where you'll see a screen similar to this, and it'll say reflective opportunity with a task underneath. And what I would encourage you to do at that point is read the task and then just pause the webinar. Just click pause and take some time to reflect and take notes for yourself, trying to capture the essences and the nuances of how the content is impacting on you, whether you're agreeing or disagreeing. And I'll try and ask you some very specific questions, and if you can relate them to your own practice or indeed your own training, or if you are training and are ready to move into practice, what that might be like in how you imagine it. These reflexive points will be the real key moments of learning for you. So whilst I hope I have something to say that's of value, actually it's the assimilation and the reflection of that where you'll really make your sense of it rather than just a PowerPoint delivered sense of it. So keep an eye out for those screens as we go along. But what I want to do is start by showing a session about some work with somebody called Anne. Anne has come to therapy, and I've been seeing her for a little while, and we're stepping into a session. And Anne is 56 years old, and she's a teacher, and she's been attending counselling for a short while. She suffers from chronic back pain and is able to to do some stuff, but not able to do some of the stuff that she's enjoyed for some time. So she feels her life is becoming limited, and as such, she's feeling increasingly hopeless about her future. So I'm going to show you this section with Anne now, and just listen to the dialogue that takes place between us.
Hello, Anne. It's nice to see you again. Do you want to start by telling me a little bit more about this week, how this week's been for you?
In a way, I've been really glad to get here to tell you that to tell someone that I've had a really crappy week. I've never known a week like it.
Right.
Terrible. Really terrible.
You look really distressed when you're telling me that.
It's just been like no other week. I've had so many thoughts about myself and about what future is ahead, and I don't know, incidents at work have, I guess, sparked things off, and I suppose it sort of centres on the fact that I guess my back pain is getting worse, and I don't seem to be able to do what I used to do, and that's not like me. And so I feel what's happening to me is not really me. It's not me.
There's lots of things happening around you and to you that are making you think about you and your future.
What future? That's exactly it.
Right. You can't see a future for yourself.
No, I can't. I always look forward to retirement, and I never thought I would have to think about maybe taking early retirement, which, I don't know, I'm someone who really enjoys the job, but just in this last year, I just feel so threatened by, I feel quite paranoid sometimes, you know, people saying that they can maybe take things over for me because they know I have a problem, and so in a way not addressing how I might be feeling, but making a point of saying I have a problem, and therefore bits of my job are going. And I think, well, what's the point really if I can't do what I used to do? I tried talking to my husband about it, and, well, it's a non-starter really.
So you're quite alone in this. There's nobody that you feel is really getting what you're feeling or what's happening to you. You said before, Anne, that you thought about your future and you couldn't see any. I wonder what that meant.
Well, with back pain that doesn't get better, I look at myself now, and they talk about the ageing process, and that's all sort of stuff with the menopause and things, and losing one's role, and as the children leave home. Well, it's true. It's true. And I know I'm not going to get better, and I think if I'm not going to get better and I'm this bad now, then, well, I'll be in a wheelchair. And I don't really see people in wheelchairs at the moment, but I'm beginning to. But before, people, I would say that I was never conscious. People in wheelchairs.
That's not a future you want for yourself.
I'd hate it.
Yeah. I have this feeling as you're talking, and I wonder if what you're feeling is about wanting to end your life. I wonder if that's what you're telling me.
I have to be truthful, and in fact it's a relief to be able to tell you that during this week I've thought of that very much.
It's been quite a strong thought for you this week.
It's very frightening as well.
Yes. What thoughts have you had? I mean, how specific have your thoughts been?
It's somehow like, because people don't notice me, or, you know, I feel so incidental at the moment, I just want to slip away. I want to go quietly.
What would that be?
Without hurt. Maybe I'm not very brave, but I just want to slip away, and then people won't necessarily need to talk about me because they won't really have missed me.
Mm-hmm. Do you know what you would do? Have you thought what you would do?
Yeah. I want to go back to the sea, near where I was born, where I used to get a lot of pleasure of walking along cliffs. And then I just want to slip away. And somehow I don't feel. Numb.
So, thinking about what we've just seen with Anne is perhaps fairly typical of what we might experience in kind of therapeutic settings. There's this fantasy, this imagine the people who are suicidal will come into the room and will just name it, and it'll be very clear that they're wanting to end their life through suicide, and that we will refer them on, and it's a kind of comparatively straightforward process. And of course that's sometimes true. But Anne perhaps represents a situation that might more commonly happen, where there's a move towards suicidal thinking that may not necessarily have intent, although Anne did talk a little bit about her intentions here, about drifting away because nobody would notice. And so, of course, we're left with a dilemma about what should we do? Should we work with Anne around her physical health crisis, her mental health crisis, and indeed probably her existential crisis? Or should we be referring on? And of course, it's an incredibly difficult position when we're left as practitioners holding the reality of this situation. It requires a great deal of groundedness in ourselves as practitioners. So I want to tell you two quick stories as to why this webinar is important to me, and why I talk about and write about and research areas around suicide. And I'll go way back to when I first qualified or was training to be a social worker many years ago. And I'll change the enough of the information that you cannot identify the person I'm talking about, but it's a real situation where I went out to see somebody I'll call Nick for the purposes of this. That's not his real name. A young male client who had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and whose physical health was deteriorating incredibly quickly. So I was asked to go out and do an assessment of how he could be best supported in his own home. And in the end, spent a lot of time talking with him. And during our conversation, he said that he'd already decided it was his intention to end his life while he still had the physical capability to do so, because he was losing fine motor movement and felt less able to do that. Kind of the things that he loved. He was in typesetting and printing, and he decided that he wouldn't want to live to a point where he was completely dependent, which threw me into a crisis, which was around, how do I kind of respond to this? Do I refer him on? Do I not refer him on? What support does he need? Does he need mental health, psychiatric support, and so on? To cut the story short, in discussion with Nick and with permission with his GP and the team in which I was based, and also his therapist, we decided that we wouldn't escalate his care, but would sit alongside him and would accompany him on his journey, not to facilitate his decision around suicide, but to help him think about whether that was the thing for him to do, and to give him opportunities to rethink and consider some of the decisions he was making. And a few months later, he did end his life through suicide. That was his decision that he stuck by. And that had all sorts of ramifications. For me personally, and this is a personal perspective, I kind of understood the dignity that Nick wanted for himself in his decision. And it kind of made sense as much as it can do for somebody who is not in that situation. Just be aware at that point and reflect on whether you agree or disagree with my personal position and how you feel about that. Second story I will tell is when I was training to be a therapist, and I worked with a woman who I will call Isabel. That's not her real name. And she was American, living in the UK, estranged from her family, was in the UK a violent relationship, had a long history of depression and anxiety, and had been in and out of mental health services for a long time, both in the States and in the UK. And I was seeing her for psychotherapy, and she'd never had talking therapy before. She'd had inpatient stay, she'd had electroconvulsive therapy, she'd had medication, which had had varying outcomes for her, but had never had talking therapy. And actually, she began to bloom. She began to grow. Her depression began to lift. Her medication was reduced. She'd stopped using alcohol. She was out of the violent relationship, and she came to a session where she was looking ahead to plan for some appointments she had booked for herself the following week for voluntary work. And she was buoyant and happy. And at the end of the session, she stood up and she said, "Oh, thank you, Andrew. Thank you. I feel really good." And so we closed the session and confirmed our appointment for the following week. And she left the building and got on public transport and went home, walked into her house and killed herself. And she had a pre-prepared mixture of medication that she'd been prescribed, which she washed down with a bottle of vodka, and was found the following morning by her violent partner, ex-partner who had broken into the house. And I received a phone call to say that she had died. And while Nick's suicide had been impactful for all sorts of reasons, Isabel's suicide was profoundly impactful. And I think even though it wasn't termed this at the time, I experienced trauma. I experienced trauma in response to Isabel's death. Professionally, that I wasn't a good enough therapist, that I'd let her down. I should have spotted the warning signs. I could have done something to keep her alive. I should have intervened. All the things I should have done that I didn't do that had resulted in her death. And a personal trauma. Isabel was somebody that I'd got to know very well, and herein lies the dilemma we all face as practitioners, that we build relationships with people that are held in a professional frame but are still human relationships. And I felt incredibly sad at Isabel's death. I felt incredibly angry with her for choosing to end her life, for not telling me she was going to do that. It felt to me at that point that she was selfish and she'd done a terrible thing and she'd attacked me in some way. These were my speculations. And I stopped practice for a while. I had personal therapy. I had really good supervision. I had a very supportive team. And actually, the thing that helped me through was not as a natural researcher, but I happened to come across research which looked at the impact of practitioners following the death of a client through suicide. And I read this qualitative research and these practitioners' experience of their encounter with death through suicide. And these people were speaking my words. It was like, this is what I knew. Suddenly I was speaking to people or hearing from people that made sense of my experience. And I then embarked on a long process of recovery, repair, restoration. I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but to a point where I was able to rebuild strength. But it took a long time and took me through academic endeavors and practice endeavors and training endeavors and self-reflection endeavors, to a point where I am today. And my trauma is long gone, and I can talk about this from a very grounded position, but there's aspects of that trauma that I want to capture. And because I write about this experience, I'm contacted very often, and indeed this week I've had a long conversation with a very experienced practitioner who has recently experienced the death of a client through suicide, and it's like hearing history repeat. And I'm struck by, and I was struck then, and I'm still struck by how little information there is for therapists, particularly around working with suicide. There is for psychiatry and psychology, and indeed some social work and mental health nursing, but for psychotherapists and counselors, comparatively little guidance. And so I embarked on an endeavor to share my story and to talk about my experience. And so this webinar in part is built on the evidence base, in part is challenging the evidence base, and is built on my process of sense making, having spoken to probably 20,000-30,000 practitioners over the years I've been talking about this and delivering training, which I hope makes sense of some of the content I'm going to show. So I need to go back, I think, and start looking at what risk means. So what does risk mean? Because risk means something about the experience with Anne, about what is Anne going to do at the end of this session. I'd like you to keep that snippet of the session with Anne in your mind as we go through the webinar, and keep it as a crisis, as a reference point indeed. And I think we have some difficulties with risk in the way risk is presented in our current literature and on our current practice guidance, because it's moved, I think, from a position of uncertainty and not knowing to a very binary position. And as practitioners, we're often encouraged to identify risk in our clients, and we're then kind of led to believe or kind of fall into believing that risk is either present or it's not present. If we identify risk, we mitigate it, we work with it. If it's not present, we can focus on the rest of the work. And I think that binary position is incredibly unhelpful in our practice, because what it does is close the relational explorative doors. Because the reality is, I would argue, the risk is present in all our lives in different forms and in different ways. It might be that we take risks the moment we leave our house in the morning, when we travel to work or travel to do some activity, or the sports we play, or the things that we do. We take decisions around our risks all of the time. If we didn't, then our world would shrink around us. It's the pushback of risk, it's the sense making of risk, it's the lived engagement with risk that actually allows life to be possible for us. So why wouldn't that be true also for the people we work with in our clinics or our rooms or online, where part of the thinking is around suicide? It is a very particular risk, but might also be an opportunity for insight and for growth and for meaning making, if we're able to engage with the person in that kind of way, in that kind of dialogue. And so I'm not minimizing the fact that there are people we work with who present at immediate risk, and that we need to attend to that risk. We do need to mitigate, we do need to keep safe. But perhaps for people like Anne, part of our task is about helping Anne to not step away from her feelings, but step alongside her feelings, so she can really explore them in a way that is much more meaningful to her. And in that exploration, in that meaning making, she can then perhaps paradoxically move to a more safe space. We have to remember as well, of course, that some of our risks are fairly neutral. They're fairly embedded in our lives. So whether we catch the bus or the train, or whether we drive the car to go somewhere, we know that there are risks in. If I was delivering a webinar on decision making in driving, it probably wouldn't touch you very profoundly. Because we're talking about suicide, it's not a topic that leaves us feeling neutral. We will have a position, it will provoke responses in us. And so we need to understand what those responses are. So if we move away from risk as binary and start to look at what risk what the word risk might mean in our everyday language. So drawing on the Oxford English Dictionary, and other dictionaries would be much similar, I have looked, there are three kind of key components to risk. One is the possibility of loss, of injury, adverse or unwelcome circumstances, a chance or situation involving such a possibility, or to act in such a way as to bring about the possibility of an unpleasant or unwelcome event. Parts 1 and 2 really speak to our increasingly risk-averse position in helping relationships where we need to mitigate and manage, because we can only identify the potential for danger or something unwelcome or frightening or difficulty or loss. Whereas even the dictionary speaks of a third possibility of risk that I think has fallen out of our therapeutic definitions of risk, which is to be bold, to be daring. And when I worked in a large university counselling centre for nearly 20 years, and I would think at any given point the young people I was working with, probably 60 to 70% had some degree of suicidal thinking, low-level ideation, occasionally intent. And of course, there were situations that I would work with the person to refer them to get other support and other services. And there were situations where I referred somebody without their consent if I thought they were in immediate risk. But the overwhelming majority of the work I did was with people where risk was part of their experience. Together, me and my client were taking a risk, we're being bold, we're being daring. That's walking the tightrope. So we need to think about what the safety nets would be. If we take this very broad definition of risk and position it in relation to our helping work, our counselling or therapy or social work, then there are different types of risk. And I've written about 5 areas of risk. I'm sure you can think of others. I'm sure that there will be others that you can think of that I've not included here. But I've defined them across those 5 areas as situational, relational, contextual, professional, and personal. I'm going to give you an example of each now as to how that might present in practice, both in general terms, but how each of those areas might speak to regularly in our helping relationships and can be linked to suicide risk. More general safeguarding concerns, the well-being of people who may be vulnerable or compromised in their life, child protection, looking after young people or minors who are subject to various forms of harm, risk of violence to others, and of course, terrorism threats and how we manage those in our work. Very specific situations. And when we talk about risk, to most practitioners, my experience is this is the one that they go to. Situational risk is the kind of benchmarking risk. So if you were going to go to a workshop or a presentation that talked about risk, you'd kind of assume they would be talking about these risk areas. But I want to touch on the other 4 that I mentioned, because they're equally important and can cause as much damage in the relationship to the client or to ourselves, both generally and in relation to the kind of suicidal feelings the client may have. Relational risks. So in the helping context, these are risks that are embedded within the relationship itself, between the dynamic, the conscious and the unconscious dynamic between the helper and the helpee. That might include sexual attraction when that's mismanaged, that people embark on sexual relationships, which in most territories would be seen as unethical practice. Or where a client is financially exploited or the management of finances in the relationship isn't carried forward. Where there's transference or counter-transference issues that are not acknowledged or are mismanaged. And if the terms counter-transference and transference don't fit in your modality, that kind of in awareness or out of awareness, where we're not kind of managing a dynamic that's taking place. So we act in a way that depletes the client's autonomy. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about unacknowledged countertransference in relation to suicide risk, because if I'm arguing the insight and the meaning of the work happens in the relationship, then therein might also mean that's where most of the tripping hazards sit as well. So we'll come back to relational risks. Contextual risks are risks that occur in the context of the therapy itself. So it could be, for example, an inconsistent or inequitable delivery of a service, that people are different types of help at different times, or there's a lack of a clear ethical position in relation to what is being offered to the client, that is not ethically grounded, or perhaps there are inconsistent expectations of the helper in the context, or indeed of the client, or poor working practices or procedures, or where a relationship has been established that's inconsistent with the ethos of helping. All things that we might identify as general risks, and in relation to suicide, a lack of clear ethical position, inconsistent expectations, lack of adherence to practices or procedures around risk, suicide risk, or indeed very poor practices and procedures that we have to work to, but are inconsistent with the type of relationship that we're hoping to create with the person we're supporting. Professional risks are about our role, the role that we held in our professional capacity as helpers, and anything that we can do to undermine the integrity of that, and thus undermine the confidence the client might have in our ability to meet with them. So maybe being accused of an action that leads to a criminal conviction that maybe hits the press, and so I, as a practitioner, or my role is brought into disrepute, or acting in a way that undermines the helpee's confidence, say criticizing the help of others to the person being helped. Oh, I saw that therapist, I've heard they're really poor, and it just creates this environment where the client becomes wary, suspicious, and untrusting of the integrity of the person that's helping them. Paying insufficient care and attention to the relationship, working in a way that undermines the relationship, perhaps when utterly exhausted, or if we're drinking or under the influence of drugs, still going into work, and general actions that can bring the profession into disrepute. And we're seeing more recently, of course, that people's behavior, helpers' behavior on social media, for example, on different social media platforms. I saw a post recently on a social media platform where a therapist had spent a really tough afternoon with a really difficult client who really irritates the life out of me, could do with a drink. And you just kind of wonder, at what point did that person pause to think what they're communicating there about their attitude or feelings towards not only that individual, but the clients they work with, or what it might be like for that client who might actively seek out or stumble across that post, and the damage that does to the integrity of the relationship. It's becoming a real pressing issue. So those professional risks, and particularly around suicide, are really critical. And again, very much situated in this are the personal risks that we can encounter, risks that relate directly to the well-being of the helper. So vicarious trauma, burnout, relationship or family difficulties, bringing those into the relationship with the client, or inappropriate self-disclosure. That's not to say that appropriate self-disclosure, managed self-disclosure that is intended to enhance a client's self-understanding isn't valuable, because in a lot of approaches it is. But where we feel we need to tell the client about our lives because it's impacting on us, and thus meeting the needs, our own needs in the helping relationship, can be particularly difficult. And of course, suicide is a bigger issue here. Research tells us that holding a caseload of people who have active suicidal thoughts can be as traumatizing to their helper as the experience of an actual completed suicide. So what I felt in response to Isabel's death can be equivalent to working in an ongoing way with a number of people, all of whom hold that potential. The impact can be very, very profound. So what I want to do there is for you to pause, maybe if you wish to pause the webinar for a while, and just kind of reflect on this question, which: what is your attitude to life, to risk in your life? How do you see your relationship to risk in your life, both in your personal life and in your professional role? And notice if there's any differences between the two. In your personal life, that might be around, say, financial risk. You know, if you're seeing a financial advisor, they will often ask, what's your relationship to risk? What's your attitude to risk in terms of investments, or maybe in terms of sports? Maybe you're into climbing or dangerous sports, or maybe you prefer not to take those risks. And how do they translate into your professional role? If personally you are a risk taker, do you find it harder to do that in the professional role, or are you often feeling contained by the context in which you work? So just pause for a moment and reflect on that. Try and capture those reflections and see how they work for you. Make a note for you, because they will change over time. Our attitude to risk is not a static entity and will be shaped by a number of things which we will look at shortly. I just wanted to revisit before we moved on the being bold and daring. And that's the notion of positive risk taking in our therapeutic work. And I talked before about the university centre in which I worked, in where a lot of my clients did have some degree of suicidal ideation. And because I didn't refer most of them on most of the time, there was a strong element of positive risk taking. And it's an important part of our helping relationships that we can hold the risk together collaboratively with our clients, assuming they have capacity to do so. Because if we don't do that, then we're kind of making a decision that all of our helping will ultimately be defined by a fairly narrow parameter. Any aspect of risk that becomes present in our work could be a boundary point for our helping relationship. Of course, our helping relationship has boundaries, but my argument here is if we're taking a risk-averse position excessively, those boundaries shrink what might be coped with or capable of exploring in the helping relationship. If we can push them out a little bit, there's more opportunity for meaning making. Positive risk taking also challenges that idea of risk not being a binary concept. The risk is there or it's not. Well, if we're working with an idea that risk is forever present, then it's really important to think about how we can bring that in to the therapeutic discourse and how we can explore that in much more meaning. So therefore, risk taking is about acknowledging the risk, putting in the measures to acknowledge the risk, make it an explicit discourse between us, and reviewing that again explicitly with our clients to see whether that risk is still containable in our work. Positive risk taking is not an abandonment of all our boundaries, but it's an acknowledgement of our boundaries and pushing them back to a point that are professionally accountable, but allow the space for exploration of things that the client might not have any other space in their lives to explore. So here we have central is the suicidal person. We have Anne, who we saw earlier in the webinar. And when we're sat with Anne, when we're sat in the room with Anne, or when we're sat online with Anne, the focus is very much about the relational dynamic between us. But of course, there are other lenses that are informing the work that we do, which we've kind of started to touch on. Our working context. You know, where are we working? Are we working in independent practice where we kind of set some of the rules for ourselves? Are we working in a statutory service? In the UK, a statutory service would be like the National Health Service or in social services departments, and there may be equivalents in different territories. Or are we working in a school or in a college or in a university? Are we working in an independent organization, a private organization? Each of those will bring a different lens to our relationship to risk and how that lens will shape our view of risk in the helping relationship. Our personal perspectives, what do we feel? When I told you the story of Isabel, or when I told you the story of Nick, what did you feel in response to those stories? My sense now of Isabel is that probably about half of me profoundly still regrets that I didn't spot the warning signs, didn't do something to help prevent Isabel's suicide, didn't do something to help give her more choices to hold and contain her through the crisis. But there's another part of me that thinks, actually, had I done that, I would have just become another abusive part of a mental health system that Isabel had had enough of, that I would be another person who had taken away choices and liberty. And actually what she did was make a decision for herself, albeit a decision with huge consequences. But actually, if therapy is about empowering the autonomy of the client, and Isabel certainly had capacity, maybe me stopping that would have been counterintuitive. Now, what you feel about that, notice what you feel about that. Notice what that provokes in you, because that will shape a lot of the work that you do. Those personal perspectives can't easily be left at the door or when we log online. Who can we refer other people onto? There is a sense that if we're working with somebody at risk of suicide, we refer them onto somewhere else. Different organizations or different territories or different regions have different crisis services. The benchmark that I'm drawing on in the UK is that they're typically struggling with funding, they're very heavily used. And so the threshold for crisis services accepting people for time many years ago, even that being higher and higher. Maybe if I'm working with Anne, I'd like to think that there were lots of other people I could refer her to, but maybe there aren't, depending on where I work. That doesn't mean to say I shouldn't try. I shouldn't perhaps try referring her to her general practitioner or medical practitioner, for example, or a mental health crisis service. But even then, they may not be able to see her. So I still have to see myself as part of Anne's solution rather than just a conduit to give her problem onto somebody else. Ethics, whether we're registered, licensed, members of professional associations or professional bodies, we sign up to kind of ethical codes or ethical frameworks. How are we balancing the ethics of our decision making, our collaborative decision making with our client from an ethical position? And what if we get it wrong? One of the biggest drivers that we know in research around working with suicide risk is the fear of getting it wrong, the fear of clients who into defensive practice, where we begin to kind of bypass what we might consider to be good ethical practice for fear of it going wrong on our watch. Policies and procedures. If we're working independently, we don't have those policies and procedures so much. We have our ethics. We might create our own policies and procedures. If we're working in an organization, likelihood we will have policies and procedures. And sometimes they can be incredibly empowering, incredibly liberating for our work. And sometimes they can be incredibly stifling of our work. And how do we manage if we feel that the policies and procedures are demanding of us that we act in a way that is inconsistent with our own personal philosophies? I did some research and asked counsellors in the UK, how do you manage the situation where you feel you're working in a context that has a policy that you profoundly disagree with? And the majority response was, I would ignore the policy and do what I think is right, which of course introduces further professional risk and contextual risk in the relationship. Because in the event of a client's suicide, one of the questions that will be asked, of course, is, were you working consistently with what you had agreed to do with your client? And were you working consistently with any policy or procedure that supported or informed your work with the client? The whole notion of risk assessment, and there is plethora of information around risk assessment, and how do we draw that and use that in our working context? How do we capture that in the work that we do? How do we use that evidence to support our decision making process? And how is that all contained in the contract? In the UK, a common contract would be that what we talk about is confidential between us unless I believe that there was an immediate risk to yourself or other people. Different regions and different territories will have different expectations and different legal parameters. Your contract needs to reflect what is the practice expectation in the context that you are working. And of course, there's the broad evidence base. And we like to think, in working with Anne, the suicidal person that sits at the center of these multiple lenses, that each lens will shine a very particular, precise sort of light onto the situation that will give us definitive answers. It was Anton Linars, a clinical psychologist practicing in Canada, who wrote an excellent book I shall refer to later, talked to the bump on the head metaphor. We all search for that particular bump on the head that will definitively tell us whether somebody is at risk of suicide or not, where of course, in fact, it doesn't exist. And no matter how we try to create objectivity in our understanding, the working context, the services, the ethics, the evidence base in our work with Anne, the reality is that all of that attempt at objectivity is filtered through my subjective lens as the helper. So ultimately, it's my interpretation of the information that will be filtered through into the relationship with Anne. That isn't necessarily a weakness. It is if we don't recognize it as such. But if we recognize that that's the dynamic that's happening, then we can make that to be quite a powerful strength. So what I want to do is pick up on some of these aspects here as we go through the rest of the webinar. And I'm going to begin with the whole concept of risk assessment, because that's the predominant way in which we talk about working with suicide risk. And of course, risk assessment, or assessment per se, is something that's very familiar to us, a systematic gathering of key and relevant information to help inform understanding of any given aspect, to help us make sense of what it is the person is presenting with. The risk assessment is exactly the same process, but determining the likelihood or otherwise of an undesired event happening, such as suicide. So risk assessment has become synonymous with negative outcome and the avoidance of that. So we're expected to use knowledge to inform our assessments of risk, drawn typically on the predominant evidence base, which is around kind of risk factors and protective factors. And so while risk assessment is an important part of our work with risk, certainly, and in the fear of getting it wrong, there's been a tendency to look at risk assessment tools as the start and stop of the work, that we use the tools to identify risk, but once sufficient boxes have been ticked or not ticked, that tells us what we should do. And that's severely problematic. The risk assessment literature and the suicide on the demographics of risk, of course, is really, really important, but it's generalized and cannot possibly be applied to the individual. If we think of Anne at a top level, in the bit of information that you saw, we would see that Anne is female, has chronic pain, she's experiencing different aspects of loss, she feels emotionally isolated, she appears to have capacity, she's engaged in a cognitive salient discourse with me, her responses are appropriate, she has suicidal ideation with some generalized plans, although it was a relief to talk about that, she said, but she is fearful of her future. So we have just in that small snapshot a whole number of risk factors and protective factors. And what's worth thinking about is if we draw on that sort of information, sitting in the chair sat opposite Anne, how does that help us or impair us in decision making about the best answer? My hunch is, my own experiences, and this might be a point of disagreement for you, that filling in a tick box form with Anne would flag some of these things, but it won't actually speak to her intention. It won't speak to her meaning making. I might get a score that points me in a certain direction, but it doesn't help me understand Anne's risk. More importantly, it doesn't help Anne understand her risks. So while such tools can be of value, they are still ultimately filtered through a subjective lens that is made up of multifaceted dimensions of all different types of experiences and perspectives. And this is where our personal perspectives are really, really critical. And these can be broad ranging, and I've just included a few here, and I'm sure you can think of some more too. Faith and spirituality, our faith, our culture, our belief system, and where suicide fits into that. Maybe our own experience of having been suicidal, or maybe suicide in our family, supporting people who've been suicidal or been bereaved through suicide. The death of those around us, personally and professionally. Certainly, Isabel's death had repercussions that echoed through the years in my work. And so that really shaped for a long time my kind of capacity to sit with and be with suicidal thinking. Music that we listen to, films that we watch, books that we read, webinars that we attend. It's a dynamic, shifting, changing process. And it's really important that at any given point, we're able to dip into that and reflect on, what do we think about suicide? I'm not here today to tell you you should think one thing or another. Some people I've worked with, I've met as colleagues, believe that everybody always has the right to end their own life if they decide that that's the right thing for them to do. Other people have said to me that they fundamentally disapprove of it. It's not something that fits with their cultural or faith or spiritual belief system. And other people kind of aren't sure where they sit, but it's a dynamic, shifting aspect. So here's a really important reflective opportunity for you. What I'd like you to do is pause the webinar at this point and think about the personal factors in your life that shape your views on suicide. What is it in your life that has touched you or speaks to you or is important to you that shapes how you might have a relationship with thoughts of suicide? Maybe times when you felt suicidal, maybe attempts on your own life in the past or those of you love. And how do you hold that information for yourself when working with a suicidal client? How do you make sure that that doesn't begin to contaminate the relationship in an unhelpful way, that it brings a lens of subjectivity that then begins to shape your responses, maybe to Anne or your client, in a way that isn't about Anne and is about you? That's not to say that your feelings and responses aren't helpful and can't in some way inform the process, but they have to be held lightly and carefully in the work. Make some notes for yourself and capture that. And maybe sometime down the line, maybe at the end of the webinar, you go back to them and see if anything has shifted. There's a lot around working with suicide that talks of the evidence base. We have a plethora of evidence around risk, and they are mostly centered around risk factors. Who is more likely to end their life through suicide and in what circumstances and in what roles? And what are the protective factors? So out of that research has become an extensive number of risk assessment tools, questionnaires, multiple choice questions, inventories, schedules, and so on. Because in some ways, none of us want to be there to get that phone call to tell us that Isabel has died. Nobody wants to be there to hear that news. And so it becomes incredibly painful to sit with the uncertainty and the subjective nature of the process. And so we have to go in search for science. We have to go in search for the objective. And if the evidence base is pointing in a very particular direction, who isn't going to want to complete those tools and those forms? After Isabel's death, I applied to do my PhD, and my PhD proposal was that I wanted to develop a short risk assessment tool for therapists that would give them some degree of knowledge and certainty on completion, whether their client was likely to end their life or not. Of course, it dawned on me during the process of that PhD that it's a bit like going to search for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It doesn't exist. It exists in our fantasy. It's something that we hope is there, because the sitting with the uncertainty of suicide can be so overwhelming that actually anything that brings certainty will be something that will be of value to us. And indeed, not just us individually, but institutions, organizations, services love the forms to be completed and for decisions to be made around allocation and discharge and escalation of services based on the outcome of those forms. Yet the reality is the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Those tools don't give us the information that we need. Large et al. In 2016, a little dated now, but still very current, which I will show you in just a moment, did a meta-analysis of a whole range of internationally used risk assessment tools and found that they were severely problematic. Risk assessment tools aim to predict the likelihood of suicide on the presence of high-risk factors. And yet what Large et al. Found was that 95% of people who identify with high risk do not die through suicide. So it's a marker that can be helpful to a point, but it's not a definitive marker. They additionally went on to say that they found no evidence that the statistical strength of suicide risk assessment had improved over time. And by over time, they specifically stated over 40 years. So the moral of the story is, which I'm going to build on in just a moment, that we put our faith in risk assessment tools and predictive tools for suicide in the hope that they will be a definitive answer. They will find, as Linars called it, the bump on the head. And yet Large and a plethora of other studies, a study that came out by the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK in 2021, also concluded that actually the one thing that these tools don't do is the exact thing that they claim to do. They can make a contribution to our understanding. They can help capture key information about the client. Importantly, perhaps, they can offer a structure and mechanism by which we can begin to talk. But what they won't do is tell us whether Anne is going to end her life through suicide or not. But that's the thing that we hope that they will do. So with that in mind, it's important to kind of think about your relationship with risk assessment tools and how they sit within your practice currently. So again, it's another reflective opportunity, which I hope you will take by pausing. And I want to ask yourself these two questions. How do you use the evidence about suicide in your work currently? Risk factors, protective factors, models of suicide, how do they currently inform your work? And in that, what role do risk assessment tools in shaping your assessment of risk, and how reliant on them are you? I worked for many years in a service where we used a risk assessment tool, and decisions around allocation for services and discharge from services were directly informed by the outcomes of those tools. I've been there, I've done it, and I felt eternally grateful for having been able to tick the boxes. But actually, given what I'm suggesting and given what the evidence is saying, that yes, of course, these tools can be useful, but generally not in terms of what it is you directly hope they will achieve. How does that shape what you do? How do you use them now, and how do you supplement them in your work? I'm going to draw on NICE, which is a UK establishment, a National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, known as NICE. And so this is a UK specific piece of information, but NICE make clinical recommendations across the physical and mental health medicines disciplines. And so they will give recommendations to whether drugs ought to be licensed and what the evidence for that is. Their task predominantly is to review evidence of best practice and to make recommendations in the UK, typically to the National Health Service. But there is also a sense that if NICE make a recommendation, that is generally seen as good practice and will speak to other contexts too. And in September 2022, and particularly on the back of the Royal College of Psychiatrists research, which I mentioned that had been published in 2021, they issued their new guidance for working with self-harm, which for them also includes suicide explicitly. And they issued a number of startling recommendations. I say startling because what they've done is reviewed all the available evidence for risk assessment tools for their efficacy in suicide prediction, and they issued new guidance accordingly. And this has thrown services, statutory services, schools, colleges, university services, independent practitioners into a whole state of rethink, because their statements are very unequivocal. So, do not use risk assessment tools and scales to predict future suicide or repetition of self-harm. As in, do not use those tools in a way that they're explicitly sold to you to be used. Do not use them. And they say don't use them because there's no meaningful evidence that they have efficacy in predictive quality. Do not use risk assessment tools and scales to determine who should and should be not, and who should not be offered treatment or who should be discharged. Just the thing we were doing in the service I worked in. This person has scored lower on risk, they can be discharged. NICE's guidance is do not use them for that because they don't have the efficacy to inform those decisions. Do not use global risk stratification into low, medium, or high risk to predict future suicide. So do not use these tools to mark low, medium, and high risk, because those demarcations, again, don't have the evidence to support their efficacy. Do not use global risk stratification into low, medium, or high to determine who should be offered treatment or who should be discharged. And focus the assessment on the person's needs and how to support their immediate and physical safety. So rather than drawing on risk assessment tools, it's a process by which we use dialogue, we use a therapeutic process to think about the work that we do and how we can create understanding within the relational aspects of our work. That surely is a point of reflection. And so another reflective opportunity for you. Having been told about the NICE guidelines, who have reviewed the international evidence, does that change your thoughts about how you work with risk? Do you agree with their assertions? Do you disagree with their assertions? If you agree with their assertions, how do you implement that in the work that you do? If you disagree with their assertions, what is it you're kind of basing that position on? And how might that help you shape your thinking in terms of future practice? So what we've been talking about so far, interesting what those thoughts are about the evidence, is the importance of the relationship in the work that we do, and how we need to try and capture the subjective in the process of the relationship and actually work with it. And the more explicitly we can make the subjective, the more important it can be. There's been that sense that what we've tried to do, as I've said, is to objectify the process by throwing science at it. And yet actually the sense making actually sits in the relationship. And if we think in terms of that, as to what's the most helpful thing for somebody who's suicidal, we perhaps need to look no further than Schneidman's quote from 1998, which is obviously a quote from a long time ago in terms of predating a lot of the kind of current challenges around working with suicide risk. And Schneidman wrote, "Our best route to understanding suicide is not through the study of the structure of the brain, nor the study of social statistics, nor the study of mental diseases, but directly through the study of human emotions described in the words of the suicidal person. The most important question to a potentially suicidal person is not an inquiry about family history or laboratory tests of blood or spinal fluid, but where do you hurt and how can I help you?" Now, what Schneidman is not doing there is saying that studies around brain structure or the social statistics or diagnostic structures or genetics or neuropsychology aren't important. He's not saying that they're not important, but what he is saying is they're not the most important thing in the moment with somebody who's suicidal. Schneidman, writing that in 1998, one of the US's leading suicidologists and one of the most foremost writers and researchers in suicide, was actually really very profound, because in a sense what Schneidman was calling out at that point was already a direction of travel that he saw was taking place. And since 1998 to where we are now, that direction of travel has gained momentum and gained more meaning. And so we have mental health systems now that are in some ways immobilized through the fear of suicide, immobilized through the potential of suicide. Certainly in the service I worked in, which was in a large university setting, in the sad event of a student suicide, the first question was often, did we know them? And when the answer was no, we didn't know them, there was a palpable sense of relief before the move into grief and the sense of the loss. We cannot overstate the level of anxiety that practitioners can feel in talking about suicide or naming suicide or exploring suicide. I undertook some research as part of my PhD that looked at the discourse of suicide within a therapeutic frame. How was suicide framed? How was it talked about? How was it shaped and spoken about? And so I had access to a large number of sessions that took place in kind of health centres and mental health centres, and that looked at how therapists, counsellors responded to their clients who we knew were suicidal in an early assessment session. So all of the clients who presented were over 18, so they were all adult clients, but they were representative of a broad, diverse group in terms of genders, in terms of age, in terms of cultural backgrounds. What they had in common, even though their stories were very diverse, were thoughts around suicide. The therapists were, again, from a diverse background, both in terms of genders, in terms of culture, in terms of age, but also in terms of modality, in terms of how they practice. So we had therapists who were person-centered, therapists who were aligned to other kind of humanistic modalities, such as TA and Gestalt. We had cognitive behavioral therapists, we had psychodynamically orientated therapists, and we had integrative therapists. And they were all, the therapists were post-qualified by a minimum of 6 years. Pretty much all of them were qualified to master's level. And so we're very experienced, well-qualified practitioners who'd been working in these settings for some time. And so I was able to capture a number of video sessions of these clients and these assessment sessions, which I was able then to transcribe and subject to a critical discourse analysis. And my discursive object, if you like, the point of the discourse I was looking at specifically was suicide. So I was looking at explicit references to suicide and implicit references to suicide. Explicit, I want to kill myself, I want to do myself in, I feel suicidal. Implicit, I want to go to sleep and not wake up, I want to get out of everybody's way, I don't want to be around anymore. And so I captured all the references to suicide across these large number of transcripts. And interestingly, there was only one at the first point of reference to suicide. There was only one where that reference was explicit. All the others were implicit. I don't mean to say that clients only talked about suicide implicitly, but at that first point in the discourse that the client introduced their thinking around suicide, it was almost always, except one, implicitly introduced. Through metaphor, through hinting at, through using the sorts of phrases that I've illustrated here. In terms of the therapist, therefore, I was interested, once I'd isolated those in the discourse, I was interested in how did the therapist respond at those points, given that we had a broad range of modalities. So we had some modalities that wouldn't routinely kind of ask explorative questions. We had some modalities who would offer some interpretations. We had modalities who might offer much more explicit questions. And I was kind of expecting that diversity of response. What I found was that regardless of modality ceased to be a defining factor here. the therapist almost exclusively, except one, almost exclusively moved to reflective questions. Sorry, reflective statements, not questions, reflective statements. And so they reflected or paraphrased the immediate meaning of what the client had said. So if a client said, I want to go to sleep and not wake up, the therapist might say, so it sounds like you want to go to sleep and not wake up. You don't want to be here. They continued with the metaphor, with the implicit, rather than making it explicit. There was one situation where the therapist was explicit in their questioning and asked directly about suicide, so actually named suicide in the session. And interestingly, that one was in response to the one client who had named suicide explicitly from the outset. So I'm not generalizing this to all therapy all the time. I have repeated the study with younger people too, and the same outcomes were found. What I'm suggesting is there may be a greater tendency for therapists to respond to implicit references to suicide from an implicit position. They mirror, they parallel the same discursive mechanism that the client had used to introduce it. When clients bring suicidal thinking in more explicitly, there seems to be pointing towards some greater permission giving in the therapist to also name it explicitly. This has huge ramifications for training of therapists and the direct work with clients. Because if Schneidman's quote is to be taken true to its heart, the most important question is, where do you hurt and how can I help you? That would arguably also be around being able to be brave and to name the thoughts of suicide quite explicitly for the client, for then meaning making to take place. We know from other research around the stigma of suicide, despite the increase in discourse around mental health on social media, including of suicide, both helpfully and unhelpfully, there remains that stigma. Suicide is still something incredibly difficult for us to talk about. Indeed, as just a side reflection, I have wondered that many years ago when Isabel ended her life through suicide, and I decided to begin writing things about my experience and developing practice guidance in the absence of any meaningful practice guidance for therapists, I kind of assumed that 30 years on, we would now be having an abundance of such practice guidance for therapists. And yet, certainly in the UK, there remains a sparsity of written materials around working with suicide for therapists working in therapeutic settings. It seems professionally, as it is individually, suicide remains hard to talk about. So Schneidman's challenge to us is actually more tricky than it seems. When we read Schneidman's quote, it's kind of, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Where do you hurt and how can I help you? But the reality is, in practice, it seems that there are lots of processes that take place in the relationship that impair the therapist from being able to take the implicit to the explicit, and in taking it to the explicit, then be able to hold and work with it with the client around meaning making, around sense making, and around helping the client to have a sense of how safe they are in their own experience. What I'm going to show you are 3 short videos. I'm going to show you 2, and then I'm going to ask you to reflect on something before I show you the 3rd. And they're with a male client called Kieran. Kieran is 36 years old, and he's recently been made unemployed. He's had a relationship breakdown, has little contact with his children since that breakdown, and has been diagnosed with depression and thus prescribed antidepressants. It was also recommended that he had therapy and thus came to see me, and he feels hopeless. The first few minutes of this session that you're going to see now is just the kind of starting session. It's just to give you a sense of the dialogue between us and perhaps moving to a point where Kieran is perhaps thinking of talking about how hopeless he feels. Just notice kind of how the dialogue develops as we proceed.
I've been thinking as you've been talking, Kieran, about what you've been saying about the relationship, the loss of the relationship, and I suppose I'm struck by how huge this loss has been for you. And as I'm saying that, I'm also wondering about other parts of your life. You know, I wonder how the breakdown in your relationship has affected the rest of your life, has affected you.
Well, it's all come crashing down, all of it. My relationship's fallen apart. You know, it's just 1 minute, you know, you're taking each day at a time, and things are going okay, and the next minute it's all gone. It's all well, it's just a mess. It's just all rubbish. It's rubbish.
Sounds huge. It's everything. It's all gone. It's all rubbish. It's all come crashing down. I wonder what there is of value for you at the moment in your life, Kieran.
Well, you know, it's all gone really. And my life, everything. It's all a mess. I mean, my relationships fallen apart, as I said, and my kids don't. I can't see my kids. I imagine they don't want to see me. I mean, look at the state of me. Work's going down the pan. I don't see what there is of value. It's just all a mess, really.
All of it. All a mess. There's nothing of value at all. It's like it's hard for you to see how to move on from this.
Well, can you see any value in it? I can't see any value. I mean, you know, what's left? I can't see any light. I don't know how we're going to turn it around, if at all. There's no bloody point, actually. No bloody point at all. Just no bloody point.
No bloody point. Feels really hopeless.
Well, I can't see any point, really, in... I mean, what value is there? I mean, in that I've just told you. I mean, I don't see any point in me being around. You know, I'm just in the way, a nuisance. Nobody wants to see me. I've got nothing left.
It's like all of this has got lost. Everything's crashed. Nothing has value. There's just no bloody point for you.
No, there's no bloody point.
So we're at a point in the session where this isn't a scripted session. There's no script here. And interestingly, Kieran has just presented again entirely consistently with the research that I've shown. He started to talk about, I might as well not be around. I might as well not be here. Nobody would notice me anyway. Nobody sees me. There's no bloody point, he's talking about. What we don't know at this stage in the session is what that actually means. We can assume, this is a webinar about working with suicide risk, after all, we can assume that Kieran is talking about his suicidal thoughts. We don't know that. We can't assume that. Kieran isn't talking about moving away, starting afresh. Nobody would miss him. He might as well not be around. We don't actually know what this means. Is it a reality for him? Is it a real literal statement? Or is it indeed a metaphor? So we have to ask about it. If it is about suicide, then what Kieran has done is, as I say, consistent with the research that I've just talked about. in that if it turns out to be the first reference point to suicide in the session, he's introduced it as a point of metaphor, getting out of the way, not being around anymore. There is no bloody point in being around anymore. So there is a therapeutic challenge here. In the study, all of the therapists, except one, all of the therapists moved into a position, regardless of their modality, whether they were CBT or psychodynamic or humanistic or integrative, moved to a position of predominantly reflective paraphrasing responses. Now, of course, there is nothing wrong with reflective and paraphrasing responses. They can be incredibly powerful. But if we're only predominantly going to use paraphrasing and reflective responses at this type of point in therapy, then there is a risk that two things happen. Firstly, we don't open up the metaphor and reality test it. We don't know whether Kieran is wanting to end his life to get out of the way or to move away to get out of the way. So we don't actually test the reality of it. The second thing we do is that we, as the therapist, we as the helper, become defined by the same metaphor. So if Kieran is trying to tell us about his suicidal thinking but feels unable to do so, we run the risk of inadvertently paralleling that. So neither of us can name it, neither of us can talk about it. And so if making sense of suicide happens in the relationship, that relationship in that sense begins to stall quite dramatically. What I'm going to do now is pick up from Kieran talking about no bloody point. And unbeknown to Kieran, as a therapist, I'm just going to use paraphrasing and reflective responses. I'm not going to ask any explicit questions. I'm just going to be consistent with how the therapists were in the study I conducted. And just pay attention to what happens therapeutically, what happens in terms of opportunities for exploration, and what happens in the discourse.
You're saying there's no bloody point, Kieran, just no bloody point. You're wanting to get out of the way.
But can you see a bloody point? I can't see a bloody point. I just can't imagine what the point is. I might as well just be out of the way. I won't be missed.
You wouldn't be missed. If you got out of the way, you wouldn't be missed by anybody.
That's about it. I think that's about it.
It's just a mess. Absolute mess.
It just keeps going round and round and round in my head. I just can't see any good. It's all gone, it's all rubbish. I mean, I've got these antidepressants that the doctor's given me, but I don't have any faith in them. And then been sent to speak to you. I mean, I guess they think that you can fix things for me, but I don't know. I can't see anything good in it.
It sounds like you just feel really trapped in this, Kieran, round and round in your head, and you just become really hopeless. You know, you've got the antidepressants and you have no faith in them. They can't help. I can't help. It's all hopeless.
I don't see any way out. I don't see any good in it. I might as well not be here.
Mm.
This is a waste of time.
Just no way out. No way out from this at all.
I can't see any. I can't imagine how it's going to help put right.
Mm.
I mean, it's, the pills or this not going to bring my children back or repair my relationship.
Nothing's going to help.
A waste of time.
Mm.
So we have a situation where I've not done anything wrong as a therapist. I think some of my paraphrasing and my reflections were pretty good, actually. And they did elicit some meaning making from Kieran. But what we've not done yet still is named what might be in the room. I've reflected, I've paraphrased, it goes round and round in your head. Pills aren't going to help. I'm not going to help. And still what we've not done is actually named suicide as a possibility. And maybe Kieran is beginning to think that actually naming suicide is not okay here. This isn't going to help. Wasting my time. If I can't talk about the things that are most pressing and most overwhelming for me here, then there's not much point in me being here. I might be inadvertently, accidentally communicating that this is not okay for me to talk about. It might not be okay for me to talk about. It really might not be okay for me to talk about, which is where our reflections around our personal perspectives are really, really important. So it's worth stopping just at this point for yourself, just for a few minutes, and to think, what were your responses to this session with Kieran, with me not asking him explicitly? Were you wanting to shout at the screen and say to me, ask him the question, ask him the question? Would you have asked him the question? How would you have phrased it? How would you have gone about it? Or maybe you wouldn't have asked the question. Maybe you feel that actually what I did was fine, that it was all right. Just take a few moments just to reflect on where it was for you. Try and capture those thoughts. What I'm going to show you now is a third and final section from this set of video clips. And in this section, I'm going to be going back. We've had the dialogue. I'm going to be going back to Kieran's comment about there's no bloody point. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to ask him about suicide. I'm going to name it. I'm going to do what I wasn't doing in the previous session or in the previous clip. In terms of this as a video, it's important to say that the pace of this is probably faster than you would do. What I'm doing here is illustrating questions in action. And actually, what I would do here was ask the question and then pause and do a lot of exploration around his answer before moving on to the next question. So one of your critiques of this might be, it was a bit fast. I'd slow it down a little bit. And I think that would probably be a reasonable critique. But what I'm wanting you to focus on is what changes as a consequence of me asking the question. What happens by me taking the implicit and bringing it into the space as explicit in terms of therapeutic opportunity?
You said there's no bloody point, Kieran. You're better off getting out of the way. Can you tell me a bit more about that? What you mean by getting out of the way? I suppose part of me wondered whether you've been thinking of harming yourself or killing yourself to get out of the way.
Well, there is no bloody point, is there? And so I think it would be just as well if I was out of the way. A lot easier for everybody.
Right. So that's what getting out of the way means. It means ending your life.
Yeah.
How much have you thought about that, Kieran? How much have you thought about ending your life? Have you thought about what you might do?
Well, no, not really. But I've got these antidepressants, haven't I? They're no bloody use in ones.
So you might take the antidepressants, might take all the antidepressants to kill yourself.
Yeah.
And yet you also said, no, not really. And when you said that, I wondered if there's part of you that doesn't want to die, part of you that wants to live.
Well, I suppose I don't really want to die. I just don't know how to live. I don't see how to turn it around.
That's the stuck bit, isn't it, that you were talking about? I don't know how to move forward from this point. Do you have a sense, Kieran, of what it is that's stopped you killing yourself? And what stops you taking those tablets?
Well, I suppose, well, my kids, I suppose. I wouldn't want to leave them. I miss them terribly.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't want them to have to live with the idea that their father's killed himself.
So your kids, they're a source of part of the big hurt for you, but they're also one of the main reasons that keeps you alive, that sense of being connected with your kids.
Yeah. I think if I didn't have the kids, I probably would have done something by now.
Mm-hmm. So that's quite a strong part of you that would have done something, but another strong part of you that hasn't. And as we're talking, I feel more hopeful. It feels as well as hopeless. There's some hope for you as well.
Perhaps.
Maybe. I'd like to come back for some more sessions of counselling. So I suppose my hunch is that talking about this might increase that hope for you.
If you think it'll help.
Yeah, it's worth a go. You'd be worth giving it a go, maybe.
Okay.
So what we have here is me asking questions quite explicitly. And again, as I say, the pace might be different. You might choose a different pace, or you might even frame the questions differently to how I frame them. There's no blueprint here. I'm not saying this is how we should always name suicide. But what I am saying is that we should name it, and we should name it really explicitly and really clearly. We shouldn't use euphemisms or metaphors. We should name it. And what you noticed when I asked Kieran, I wonder if what you're telling me, Kieran, is about ending your life. He moved back, he said yes, and he moved back to the metaphor. And I actually very deliberately and consciously continued to use clear, uncomplicated, unambiguous phrases around suicide and dying and killing yourself until that became a discursive anchor, if you like, for Kieran to be able to anchor onto that. And then we learned quite a lot of things quite quickly. We learned that yes, he was thinking of ending his life, and he had thought about taking an overdose of the antidepressants to do that, which of course on the risk factor basis are several risks. He's middle-aged, he's male, he's having suicidal ideation, he's experienced significant loss, he's got the means, he's got some early plans. And yet the questions also began to open up something more bespoke, something more individual. So rather than taking the broad meaning that we can get from risk factors, we began to look at Kieran's factors and importantly, also Kieran's protective factors. And I would suggest that there are two key things that we need to do above all else in asking about suicide. And one is to ask the question clearly and unambiguously in a way that the client can make sense of. And the second question we ask if the person is feeling suicidal is, how have they not been able, or rather, how have they not acted on those thoughts to this point? How are we able to sit here and have a discussion about it? And that's really, really critical, because what you're doing in that is inviting your client. What I was doing in that was inviting Kieran to begin to name some of his protective factors. And rather than me trying to emotionally manipulate my client by saying, but what about your children, Kieran? What would it be like for them if you ended your life? Kieran was able to name his children as one of his big protective factors. My kids, I guess. I wouldn't want to not be around for my kids. Here, In the middle section that we saw where I didn't ask the question, what was effectively happening was the sound of closing therapeutic doors, ends of conversations. What we saw in this last section was the opening of therapeutic doors, and any one of those points could have taken Kieran and I into much deeper exploration. The asking of the question, the exploring of the answer is absolutely critical and goes well beyond what a risk assessment tool can offer, even though we can keep the aspects of that usefully in our mind in terms of generalized factors. What I'd like you to do is, again, pause just for a few moments. And what do you think? And now you've seen this third section, what did you think changed as a consequence of me asking about suicide specifically? Did anything change meaningfully? What did you think about how I phrased it or what I said? Would you do it differently? Would you have said it differently? Do you feel comfortable or uncomfortable with naming suicide explicitly? And particularly perhaps if the client has alluded to it very generally or perhaps not mentioned it, but you wonder if it's around for them. So what I learned from this study was that suicide is often not disclosed by the client openly at first reference point and is instead talked through metaphor. And practitioners, regardless of modality, can have a tendency to revert to predominantly reflective responses because they want to stay just behind or alongside the client, rather than what they might need to do is just to stay slightly ahead at some points. So it seems like, so you're saying that. And the problem is, if we're using predominantly reflective or paraphrasing responses at this point in a session, it will hinder an exploration of risk. At best, it means it doesn't get talked about. At worst, it means it communicates to the client that this is not okay to talk about. Perhaps because practitioners are fearful of naming suicide, including with younger people, for fear of putting the thought in the client's mind. So the exploration becomes impaired, the practitioner's fearing but not knowing. And I can recall a supervision discussion I had with a supervisee some years ago, where the supervisee came and said, I'm really concerned about this client. I think she's a real risk to herself. And I said to the supervisee, how did she respond when you asked her about that? And the supervisee said, oh, I didn't ask her about that. That would have felt far too much. She was far too distressed. And as they said it, the penny kind of dropped that this was his anxiety that he was projecting onto the client and making her too vulnerable and too fragile to have this discussion, rather than something that actually would have been more helpful. The analogy I would bring here to asking about suicide is a horror film analogy, because I really like horror films. And for me, the scariest horror films are those ones where you never actually see the threat. It's in the woods or the cellar or the attic or the shadows. You never actually see it, because then in the absence of the threat, what you do as viewer is formulate your worst fear, and you put that fear into the space that the director or writer has left. And that can be terrifying. In the advent of computer-generated graphics and the technologies, in my humble opinion, many of the modern day horror films fall foul of the fact that the director or writer, because they have the technology available, cannot help but introduce the threat. And they can make the threat as disgusting and as horrible as it looks like. But as a viewer, once you've seen it, a little bit of the horror spell has been broken. And that's an analogy I would offer for working with suicide. We kind of fear that asking the question and getting the answer would be the really scary bit, whereas in fact, it's probably not asking the question that is really scary. So I can't imagine there's many of you watching that wouldn't agree with that. I wouldn't think, yeah, well, of course I would ask a question. But I imagine that most of those therapists who were in my study, if they were watching this webinar, they would also think that too. But there was something that happened in the moment that stopped them asking the question. And this is where the literature and unacknowledged countertransference comes in, and it's available in all sorts of writings and publications. The ASHE conference, which was a collection of high-profile suicide researchers, really have delved deep into the acknowledged countertransference. And I've referenced at the bottom Anton Lanier's book, which I mentioned earlier, which is person-centered therapy with suicidal clients, or a person-centered approach. And he's not actually referring to person-centered as in Carl Rogers' person-centered. He's using the term more generically as in being centered on the person. But in there, he talks about unacknowledged countertransference and the ways that can present in the therapy. And the countertransference might be aspects of things that are happening in the relationship, aspects of the person that we're working with that we've not brought into our awareness, or it may be issues of suicide or their circumstances. But ultimately, what it means is that in asking the suicide question, we can become silenced, we can become immobilized. And here's some examples of how unacknowledged countertransference can present in the kind of therapeutic helping discourse. As practitioners, we can underestimate the levels of distress or the levels of intent. We can, in our mind, kind of turn the volume down on them. So we can say, well, Anne talks about wanting to go back to the sea where she grew up, but actually, I don't think she quite meant it. And we kind of collude with our turning down of the volume of the risk. As such, we can actively avoid an exploration. So where I might go with that, or indeed where I went with Kieran after the camera stopped, was how he could keep himself safe in the meantime. What we do is we actively avoid the exploration of risk, like my supervisee. Oh, I didn't ask her because she was too vulnerable. We can be too quick to be reassured about lack of risk or claims of improvement. Oh, I felt that, but I don't feel that now. Or no, I don't think so. And we take it at face value. And sometimes it might be because that's actually true, that the client's risk has decreased. But there's nothing harmful in just pushing that a bit and saying, I just double check that with you, because last time we spoke, you were really struggling and I really heard how strong those suicidal thoughts were. And that seems like a big change in the time. Talk to me a little bit more about that change, and just to test it out a little bit. We can minimize the importance of our relationship. You know, maybe as a therapist, I'm only seeing this person 30 or 50 or 60 minutes a week, and there's lots of other people in this person's life. There's this person and that person and that person, and they'll ask, or the client will tell somebody, and you know, it doesn't really matter if I don't ask the question. Whereas the reality is, of course, we might be the only one who's going to ask the question. So we undermine the significance of what it is we're offering. We can sometimes cease to engage our clients in therapy because it's too painful for us to go there. And so we can kind of connect with a client's ambivalence, and that translates into perhaps sometimes a premature ending of therapy. And of course, we can parallel the client's process. We too can feel overwhelmed. We too can feel hopeless. We too can feel there is nothing that we can do to change here. What we don't know can't hurt us. If we don't ask the question and the client doesn't actually tell us the answer, we don't actually know what the client's thinking. So if something should happen, we didn't actually know something that we should have acted on, or could have acted on, or could have explored more. So if it's kind of hidden and out the way, then we can legitimately argue that it wasn't there. Another thing I would add here would be probably the biggest myth about working with suicide, that if we ask the question, we might prompt suicide. We might put the thought into the client's mind, and there is no research evidence that supports that to be true. When you ask a client about suicide, you'll get one of three answers. They'll say no, because no, they're not feeling suicidal, or they did historically, but that's not an issue for them now. They'll say yes, because they are feeling suicidal. And going back to the horror film analogy, we think that's a scary point, but then we know what we're dealing with, and we can have that dialogue. Or they'll say no, because they mean yes, but they're not quite ready to talk to you about it yet. But what you've done by asking the question is clearly communicate, this is all right for us to talk about. this is all right for us to explore. And that's a risky thing to do, because what is most consistent in the literature, the second largest body of literature around working with suicide, probably away from risk factors and protective factors and demographics, is that practitioners, social workers, therapists, mental health nurses, community workers, medical practitioners, psychiatrists, the list go on, can often share that sense of incompetence, of fear, of anger, of anxiety, of impotence, of not wanting to be there if it goes wrong. Nobody wants to get the phone call about Isabel. So risk assessment sure has its place. Risk tools can offer some information, but using our skills, our communication skills, our therapy skills can open up something that is otherwise two-dimensional and make it more three-dimensional. It provides an opportunity to really hear the pain and anguish of the client. I mean, really to hear it. It provides a therapeutic opportunity to increase insight and awareness. If a client has capacity, you are not going to keep the client alive. Your task is to position the client collaboratively to help them keep themselves alive. So the key to that is about increased self-awareness, increased engagement. It creates the best opportunity to help the client, and that what we hear and what the client hears is contextually relevant, contextually meaningful, and it enables them to think about their future. So if we brought the risk assessment lens that we talked about, the risk assessment lens, back to Anne, just to remind you, we talked about Anne is female, she has chronic pain, she's experiencing different aspects of loss, she feels emotionally isolated, she does appear to have capacity, she has suicidal ideation, she does have some generalized plans. It was a relief to be able to talk about it, and she's fearful for her future. All important information for sure, but actually doesn't give us a lot of insight into what it's like to be Anne. If we additionally introduce the suicide exploration lens, then things become much more three-dimensional. We see that Anne is frightened. She doesn't know what to do. She's grieving. She longs for a time when she was happy and free from pain. She feels burdened, and she feels that she is a burden too. She can be helped to name what has kept her alive and can reflect on different ideas about her future, while also exploring that pull that she's had this last week that was a relief to be able to talk about, that sometimes I do think of ending my life and I do have these fantasies of what it would be, and to reality test that for her and how she keeps herself safe, and how in this last week when she's had those thoughts, has she been able to bring herself to talk to me today and not actually take herself back to the sea and end her life. This is the really meaningful, visceral exploration of Anne's experience that goes way beyond the top level factors, which are interesting, relevant, helpful, but actually don't even touch the surface. So another reflective opportunity for you. I'm saying some quite strong things here that you might have views about. I might be challenging ways in which you've been practicing for some time, or I might be speaking something that you know has been the truth and this is how you worked through your career. Or I might be saying things that are consistent with your training or inconsistent with your training. So I just want you to, again, pause the webinar and think, well, what do I think? Risk assessment, risk exploration, both? And how would you critically evaluate the relative strengths and weaknesses of both approaches, thinking about the people you work with and the context you work with? If you are predominantly working within a risk assessment lens, does the notion of risk exploration and that three-dimensional engagement at a relational dialogic level bring something else or not? And if it doesn't, how might it fall short, do you feel? So what I've talked about with Anne and also with Kieran is how we might have discussions to help them keep themselves safe. And if we just remind ourselves of the nice guidelines about not using risk assessment tools, they also make one further suggestion, which I think is something that we as therapists or we as mental health practitioners can work really effectively with. And they say, what is most helpful working with a suicidal client is a written, prioritized list of coping strategies and or sources of support that the person who has self-harmed or who is suicidal can use to help alleviate a crisis. Components can include recognizing warning signs, listing coping strategies involving friends and family members, contacting mental health services, and limiting access to self-harm or methods of suicide. What they're basically talking about, in a sense, is what we might know of a keep safe plan or of a crisis plan. And I, for one, as a practitioner, use these quite extensively with people, but I don't use them as a tick box process. I use them in a way that they become embedded in the therapeutic discourse. So they become part of our exploration, not something to the side that we bolt in. I would suggest that keep safe plans or crisis plans are a better way forward than no harm contracts. A no harm contract, which I know does sit within some modalities of therapy, is a contract where the client makes a commitment, verbal or written, to the therapist that they won't take any action to harm themselves between this and the next session. And some people use them very successfully. The literature is much more skeptical of no harm contracts, and some of the criticisms of no harm contracts have been that they are kind of exploitative and emotionally difficult, that clients aren't generally really in a position to be able to make that sort of commitment. They introduce potentially a fracture in the relationship, because if I've promised you something and then I've been unable to meet that promise, it might be very hard or shaming for me to come back and acknowledge that. And that also no harm contracts can often be used where the practitioner has insufficiently explored risk. It's more reassuring for me that you promise to not hurt yourself than to actually engage with the dialogue. Interesting on your thoughts on that. A keep safe plan or crisis plan, if used therapeutically, performs several important functions. It carefully outlines the risks, focusing on the inter and intrapersonal nature of the risk and self-support. It highlights the dangers, it highlights the risks, it highlights the protective factors and what supports are available. It's a collaborative therapeutic process between helper and helpee, and it's presented in a way that the client can make sense of and can take away at the end of the session. It should be reviewed, it should be part of our regular process, and be inclusive of others wherever possible. If we go back to the NICE statement, a written prioritized list of coping strategies and or sources of support that the person who has self-harmed or be suicidal can use to alleviate a crisis. Components can include recognizing warning signs, listing coping strategies involving friends and family members, contacting mental health service, and limiting access to methods. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about a therapeutically informed, not an administratively informed keep safe plan. And a really good starting point of that is to use basic scaling. So what I might do with Kieran, or indeed with Anne, is say, just to check with where you are at the moment, Kieran, as we're talking. Let's say number 10 is that the thoughts of suicide are overwhelming. They're almost impossible for me to resist. And 1 is that I have no thoughts of suicide at all. No right and wrong answer, but just best guess. Where would you place yourself just at the moment as we're talking? And say Kieran says a number 4. And then we'd take some time exploring that. And we would say, okay, so at the moment, there are thoughts of suicide as we're talking at the moment. And then I would ask them, at the worst times, Kieran, how high does the number get? And maybe Kieran says 8. And so we'll really talk about that. And I might have a piece of paper or a pen that I'll write on, or Kieran writes on, or if I'm working with younger people, images that represent of what we're talking about. Or if I'm working online, have a shared screen that I can capture this. And if I'm writing it, I'll write it in the first person as if it's the client's words. So I will put today, and I'll put the date and time. I was feeling around a number 4, and I'll have the scale at the top so they can cross-reference it. At my worst times, I can feel 8. And then, of course, I would ask the best times. Maybe they say 2. The thoughts never quite go away, but they go down to such a level that they're not relevant at all. And then I begin to ask, so let's focus, Kieran, on when the number goes up. What pushes the number up for you? What happens when the number goes up? What are the things that trigger that? And so he'll start to tell me, or we'll spend some time trying to explore that, and I'll write that down. I feel worse when I don't see my children. I feel worse when I feel disregarded. I feel worse when I've had a drink. I feel worse at 4 o'clock in the morning. And so I'm writing these things, and then we get to a point of what pushes the number down. Well, I feel better talking to you. I feel better when I think of my kids. I feel better when I go and see the GP. I feel better when I'm kind of connected with people. I feel better when I'm at work. I feel better when. And so what we're capturing here are individual risk factors and protective factors. We're capturing for Kieran at that point the things that make him feel better, the things that make him feel worse. And what I'll have on that form will also be a series of support options for him. So I might have national numbers of helplines or details of his local emergency centre or crisis team. And what we might also put down are people that he would identify in his life that he could speak to and write their names down. And he can take that away. I'll take a photograph of it with his permission, and that can go in my notes, but he can take that away. And what we're doing here is serving several purposes. First and foremost, and most importantly, is that we're having a meaningful, explorative, three-dimensional discussion of suicide in relation to Kieran's experience, taking as many opportunities as we can to explore that in more detail. We're also providing a space where Kieran can really begin to understand those things that make him feel worse and those things that make him feel better. And he has a list of those. And that those are the things that make him feel better, supplemented with the support options, can be a menu of choices for him at times of difficulty. It's also a reference point in the future, whether things are getting worse or whether things are getting better. And it's a good benchmarking for us if we have a sense that the client is able to work with that or not work with that. And because I've got a copy of that in my notes, let's say I get that most dreadful phone call that I did with Isabel. One of the questions that will be asked of me as a practitioner is, what did you do? What discussions did you have? And what did you base your decisions on? And rather than, as I often hear therapists talk about or practitioners talk about gut feeling or feelings, I can draw out the plan and I can give a really clear account of the explicit way that we explored risk. One thing is a fact. No matter what we do, no matter how helpful we are, no matter how engaged we are, no matter what services are made available to people, sadly and tragically, some people will still end their life through suicide. We are not expected to be able to predict the future. We are not expected to be able to prevent every single suicide, but we are expected to be able to offer a clear, professional, ethical narrative of what we've done, how we did it, and why we did it, and the client's part in that. And a keep safe plan really enables you to do that. I did create some resources, which are UK-based resources, and the website is there. They belong to the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, but they're free to access. So you're able to access these resources online. And what they are a number of videos of me working with a client called Jackson, where Jackson has a number of thoughts around suicide. And there are several videos, one of which sees me having an opening session with Jackson. One of it sees me replicating the situation as I've shown you with Kieran when I don't ask him about suicide, one where I do ask him about suicide. One where we begin to generate online a keep safe plan, so you can see at least my version of how that works in practice. And then there are some additional videos about my reflections as a practitioner, what I felt at that point and what was going on for me, to give you a little bit of insight. So an opportunity just to pause again. Do you use keep safe plans or crisis plans in your work? What works for you and where do they fall apart? Where do they not work in your view? And is there anything that can be adapted to make them more helpful? And I've made some assertions from the literature about no harm contracts, and no harm contract might sit centrally to your work. So if you were to kind of come back critically against the literature that has criticized them, what would be your critical rationale for using them, and why, in your view, do they work? So I guess what I'm inviting you to do is just take a few moments to think about, how do you position your client in the dialogue to make better sense of their suicidal thoughts, feelings, ideation, or intent? And how do you position your client to be able to leave the session with some resources to help themselves keep themselves more safe? So as we're drawing towards the end of the webinar, I wanted to pay some attention to the personal risks that we talk about, going right back to the beginning of the webinar, and personal risks was one of the key factors here. And if you remember, personal risks were often sat around impact on self, impact on family and friends and relationships, of those coming into our work, of trauma, of compassion fatigue, and of vicarious trauma. And vicarious trauma, because of the reasons I've said around the literature and how holding risk in our work can be incredibly demanding on ourselves, on our psyche, on our well-being. Just to take a few moments to think about how that can demonstrate and why it can demonstrate. There are all sorts of definitions of vicarious trauma. I've gone with this one, which is a really accessible, simple, makes lots of sense to me definition, which is vicarious trauma is what happens to your neurological or cognitive, physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual health when you listen to traumatic stories day after day, or respond to traumatic situations while having to control your reaction. Vicarious trauma is strongly linked to working with suicidal clients and following the suicide of a client, and none of us are immune. That sentence, end of the sentence, that says listening to traumatic stories or meeting people in their suicidal place day after day while having to control your reaction is really, really critical here. I've heard therapists at various trainings that I've delivered say, I'm so used to working with this, it just doesn't bother me anymore. And I've heard therapists say, I feel so scared about suicide in my practice. Sometimes my anxiety is really high. I feel more concerned about the practice of therapists who say this doesn't impact on me anymore than I do of the people who are anxious. Because you can learn to turn down the anxiety. You can learn to sit with the anxiety and to sit with the unknowing and the uncertain and create the safety nets along the lines that we've talked about. It's much harder to turn back up the feeling once we've switched it off. And a point of reflection that's worth thinking about, if we think we are immune to vicarious trauma in working with suicide, then we are probably the very practitioners that it is most likely to impact. And I've seen amongst my professional colleagues and friends, the extent of the work they've done has slowly chipped away and slowly chipped away. And if you look at 4 simple stages of vicarious trauma, I can see these having mapped out, and we can relate to some of them. That physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion that we can feel, the getting home at the end of the week or turning the computer off at the end of the week where we feel absolutely exhausted. And if we don't do things that are going to replenish or be restorative, we then run the risk of moving into stage 2 of the presentation, which is much more about shame and doubt. And that comes because as helpers, we come into this because we have a drive to be there and support others. And if we feel depleted in doing that, we can feel very shameful about ourselves, that we're not good enough helpers, we're not good enough therapists or social workers or mental health workers, and we begin to doubt ourselves and we internalize. And if we don't recognize that at that point, the danger is it moves into stage 3, which is around cynicism or callousness or dissociation. That dissociation that we turn in, which is this doesn't bother me anymore, or the cynicism or callousness where we look at our down, it's like, oh, for goodness sakes, it's not them again. They really get on my nerves. This person goes on and on and on about this, and we just disconnect from empathy. Whatever your modality, empathy and that relational connection is critically important. And at stage 3, the empathy is disconnected from. And if we don't attend to that at that stage, we run the risk of moving into stage 4, which is failure, helplessness, and our own well-being crisis and emotional crisis. And I sadly have seen superb practitioners sadly head through this process too often. There are 3 areas. Amanda Lacombe wrote around 3 areas in which we can focus on self-care, and our managerial self, our therapeutic self, and our career self. The managerial self is around workload, the deadlines that we set for ourselves, the nurturing that we have or don't have in our working environment, and the importance that we place on professional relationships and networking. The therapeutic self is clearly around the impact and vicarious trauma and burnout, and paying close attention to how we might be slowly eroded over the time by that kind of pressure of weight of emotion that we're encountering. And the career self, how we can be replenished by continual professional development, the acquisition of new skills and knowledge, and that career development. So we have a sense of movement towards rather than a depletion from. So what I'd like you to do again is take a reflective opportunity to think, write down, try not to overthink it, get a piece of paper, excuse me, and write down as many things that you do in your life that make you feel good, things that make you feel happy. They don't have to be in relation to therapy. It could be cooking or swimming or nature or art or television or books or whatever it is. And you write as many of those things down, and don't start the webinar again until you've got a nice, healthy list of things that you have written down that are good for you, help you feel good. Then perhaps after the webinar, and one of the learnings that you could take from the webinar is to look at that list and think, how can I make explicit use of these as a professional self-care strategy? How can I introduce some of these into a systematic way in which I look after myself? One of the things I notice around self-care is when you ask around self-care, people say, oh, I make sure I eat well and I sleep well. And I kind of challenge them and say, okay, well, or this idea came from somebody's presentation I saw recently, where it's like, okay, well, if you think of Maslow's hierarchy, eating well and sleeping well are kind of right at the bottom of that hierarchy. As the person said who was delivering the training I went to, that's just surviving. That's not self-care. That's just surviving. So you need to get that right, but you need to be thinking of a few steps up the hierarchy that are really going to replenish your emotional or your spiritual psyche or existential psyche, something that's going to help you feel much more grounded in the work. And to finish, just a few thoughts about, I guess, where I started, which was the death of my 2 clients through suicide and how they impacted on me, and how that very real bereavement and sometimes trauma can be a real fact for us as practitioners. And just to pay a little bit attention to the notions of bereavement through suicide. It may be our own bereavement through suicide, or indeed it may be clients that we're supporting who've been bereaved through suicide. And this material comes from UK SOBS, which is Support After Bereavement of Suicide organisation. And they're just making some assertions that bereavement is bereavement, grief is grief. And in addition to that around suicide, there may for some people be some additional factors. The circumstances of the loss can further shock and trauma can lead to further shock and trauma depending on the circumstances. The completely unexpected phone call about Isabel after she had shaken my hand and told me how great she was feeling just 12 hours before was devastating, absolutely devastating. And it was the last thing that I had anticipated. The emotional and physical reactions are obviously very similar to bereavement, can often be with greater intensity. The post-traumatic stress, the witness to the death maybe for some people, or the finding the body, or even the visualization of the body. I had a strong visceral image of Isabel following her suicide, which probably was far removed from the reality of it. But for me, that was my reality of it, and that compounded what I think very much was post-traumatic response that I encountered at that point. Survivor questions, which are equally applicable for us as practitioners. You know, why did Isabel do this? What should I have done to stop it? Why didn't I see it coming? I know the evidence, I know the factors, I know she was at risk. Why didn't I do something to stop this? And the stigma and isolation, the stigma of suicide, as we've discussed, is still very, very prevalent. The impact of the death itself, as well as the naming of suicide, can leave people further isolated and struggling with shame. And in the context of practitioners, that's very true. And the person I spoke to recently who'd experienced a suicide feels huge shame as what they describe themselves as a failed practitioner. If I was a good enough practitioner, I would have kept my client alive, which of course is almost certainly not true. But it is the stigma and shame that the practitioner holds through that particular lens. It also can highlight existing stress points within families or communities or within teams or within systems or within our private practice. Things that have been unspoken then can often be spoken at a time of particularly high distress. Other prejudices, things that we should have done, maybe organizations that we're working with, the contextual risks, if you remember we talked about, lack of privacy. I supported a friend who saw somebody in a particular context who professionally who ended their life through suicide, and she found herself on the front pages of the paper, even though she had done an impeccable job in supporting this person. There is this insatiable media quest to delve as deeply as possible into human misery sometimes, and that can be a profound challenge. Inquiries, coroner's hearings, and so on. I've supported many practitioners through coroner's hearings, which can be incredibly difficult. In the UK, the purpose of a coroner's hearing is to create a narrative around suicide rather than apportioning blame. But in a sense, that's a technical nicety, because if you're presenting at a coroner's hearing, it can very much feel like apportioning blame. And of course, what do we do in the aftermath, both personally? Did I go to Isabel's funeral? Would her family have welcomed me there? What support did I need? What support did they need? So there are particular things that we need to pay attention to. We've covered a huge amount in this webinar, and what I would really encourage you to do is take the opportunities of the reflexive questions that I posed you to really think about you and your practice. And it may well be that there's things here that you profoundly disagree with or strongly agree with, or have really changed the understanding you have about yourself and your practice with suicide. I hope in as many ways as possible this has spoken to you as a practitioner, it's spoken to you in your work, in whatever context and with what clients you work with, and that there's at least something that you can take away that can be of value. So I really appreciate you watching this webinar, and I hope it answers more questions than it raises for you.
It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Andrew Reeves. Andrew is a social worker. He's a licensed psychotherapist and counselor, as well as a coach. Welcome, Andrew, and welcome to our Suicide and Self-Harm Summit.
Thanks, Tracy. Delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So, Andrew, you have spent many, many years suicide, self-harm, suicide prevention. Tell me a little bit about how did you really get into that specialism, something quite unique and not really something everyone goes into?
Yeah, and so I first trained as a social worker and had never imagined that all these years on this would have become my specialism. It kind of a specialism that found me really in quite difficult circumstances. I'd started volunteering working with Samaritans, which is an international organization, as we know, supporting people who are suicidal as kind of voluntary work, which I'd really enjoyed, if enjoyed is the right word. I mean, it was fantastic training and it was really fulfilling work, but never had imagined it would become a professional role. And to cut a long story short, I experienced the suicide of a client as a social worker very, very early on in my career. And then likewise experienced the suicide of a client early on in my psychotherapy career. Different circumstances, and probably the work with the client in my social work was the suicide was more expected. They talked about it, and it was a consequence of kind of physical ill health that they were struggling with, and a kind of decision they had made for themselves. My psychotherapy client was progressing really, really well, and I remember she shook my hand at the end of the session and told me how great she was feeling, and she left the session, got home, and ended her life at that point. And so that was profoundly traumatizing personally and professionally. And I think at that point I had to start on a sense-making journey, really. I had great supervision. I undertook some personal therapy. I had a really supportive team that I was based in. I was based in kind of statutory mental health services. But actually the impact of someone's death with whom that you were working incredibly closely in a therapeutic relationship, unexpectedly, and you were the last person to see them, was like a devastating impact. And having read lots of things, I mean, certainly in the UK, there wasn't a lot of information really for therapists for the impact of and the work with clients who were suicidal. More so in perhaps in the analytic literature, it was there, and certainly a lot of really good analytic literature that was coming out of the States. People like Maltzberger and Jobs and others, Schneidman. But in terms of practice application for me as a therapist, very little. And so I kind of started. I did a master's degree which looked at the experience of therapists working with clients who were suicidal. And it was at that point that I started interviewing people, and they were talking about their experiences, and their experiences were very similar to my experiences. And I'd gone from a place of feeling very lonely professionally to suddenly kind of finding a discourse and a community that I could relate to, which was very healing. And the story goes on from there. And I won't bore you with my entire career, but my entire career has ultimately been about really trying to help us talk much more about talking about suicide. And when I did my doctorate, which was about integrating suicide assessment into the therapeutic discourse, I remember one of my participants saying, you're like Sir Galahad, who is a knight from legend, who is riding out to try and save the nation because you felt such a failure in yourself. You wanted to protect us from that. And she was absolutely right, of course. You know, I'd gone on a bit of a mission, a bit of a crusade, really, which I've long put down. But 35 years on, we still don't talk an awful lot about it. There still isn't a huge extent of literature for therapists in working with suicide. And I have been contacted countlessly over the years by therapists who've also experienced the suicide of a client and who too have been devastated. So there's a lot of work to do. So that's kind of what brought me into this, Tracy. It found me rather than I went searching for it.
Mm. And they say, Andrew, that there are those therapists who have lost someone to suicide, and there are other therapists that haven't, and hopefully never will. But seems to be a definite change. I'm one of those two who have lost a couple of patients to suicide. Do you want to talk a little bit about maybe the impact and how, if it does happen, because there's a lot of suicidal ideation around, and especially with sort of, younger populations sort of coming up, and just the state of the world we're in, there's so much going on. Do you want to say a little bit about, perhaps what, some of the self-care, some of the things that therapists can do if it does happen? Hopefully it never happens, but when it does happen, maybe some of the things that you learned that were really sort of golden nuggets on, on your journey.
No, yeah, absolutely. I think, well, there are a lot of therapists, a lot of practitioners who experience the suicide of a client, and as you say, probably many more who haven't. There's also, just before I move on to your specific question, still a lot of therapists who think that they haven't worked with high degrees of suicide risk, and I do a lot of training around working with suicide, and it's not uncommon for somebody of 15, 20, 30 years experience to say to me, I don't think I've ever really worked with somebody who is kind of highly suicidal. And we get into the dialogue, and I kind of think, really? I imagine you probably have. And so there's something about, first of all, how we as therapists need to be able to open the dialogue about suicide with clients, with patients. And, research tells us, some research of my own, was that at the first point of reference to suicide, clients can often allude to suicide or talk about their suicidal thoughts in metaphor, or kind of hint at it. Sometimes I wish I could go to sleep and not wake up. Sometimes I wish I could get out of people's way. So I think there's a real need for us as therapists to be confident enough and grounded enough to be able to kind of ask the suicide question. I wonder if what you're telling me is sometimes you feel like ending your life, and then to explore it from there. I think actually that's probably one of the first things I would say in good self-care, which is having the confidence to engage in the dialogue while you can. And the metaphor I've used is the horror film metaphor, that the scariest horror films, for me at least anyway, are the ones where you never see the threat. You imagine what the threat is. As soon as you see the threat, there's something about the horror that's broken, and you kind of know what you're dealing with. And I liken that to working with suicide. We feel that not asking the question will help us feel less anxious. Whereas actually it's not asking the question that will really lead us to anxiety, because then in that unknown we can have the tendency to project. So I think stage one of really grounding ourselves and taking care of ourselves in working with ongoing suicide risk is about that willingness to really engage with and openly and transparently and directly talk to our clients about suicidal thoughts. And if they have none, then that will become clear very quickly. But we've communicated that this is all right to talk about. It's very difficult to safeguard against the impact of suicide, however. And I mentioned 2 suicides I'd experienced. The first one was impactful for me, but kind of I was able to make a different sort of sense of it because of that client's particular situation and the dialogue we'd had about it. I think the other client's suicide, the one who left the therapy room, was because it came as such a surprise. And we had talked about suicide, but it came as such a surprise. And I think I was left with that feeling of what should I have spotted, what should I have prevented, what should I have done? I'd let her down, I'd let me down. And I think that there has to be an acknowledgement that sadly sometimes people will end their lives through suicide despite our absolute best efforts. But if we find ourselves in a situation, then I think having the confidence to have meaningful and connected discussions with others, and particularly others who can relate to that experience, is really, really important. Obviously, we need to be mindful of client confidentiality, patient confidentiality. So I'm absolutely not suggesting that we should talk openly to anybody about this, but to use our professional networks, our supervision, to really begin to make sense of the process that's happened. But my experience in supporting people, and I spoke to somebody just 2 weeks ago about this, is that at some level there is a process that we need to work through, and that happens because what we do is embedded in a relationship, and suddenly there's an abrupt, sad, often tragic end to a relationship that we have to make sense of. So reaching out, there's some really good literature now about kind of postvention support, things that we can do for ourselves, the things that we can do with others, kind of reflective practice groups, supervision, our normal self-care strategies, personal therapy, if that's helpful to us, talking with colleagues who perhaps have been connected with the situation, or people have reached out to me and talked to me about their impact without kind of identifying client information away. So finding your person that you can talk to that can help listen and begin to balance the many competing things that will be going through your mind.
Mm. And one of the things I hear you talking about is, if a client, a patient starts to sort of mention maybe in metaphor, as you're sort of talking about, or maybe directly, is really starting that kind of risk assessment, that kind of, for a therapist, okay, you're really listening with a much closer ear. You're starting to really start to assess what is the risk here with this particular individual. Do you want to talk about that? Firstly, for individuals, a lot of people are in private practice globally, certainly for this conference that we're putting together, and maybe just talk about some of the pros and the cons about sort of assessment around sort of suicidal ideation first, then suicide.
Yeah, it's a real driver in practice, I think, kind of risk assessment. And we are often taught about risk assessment, and there's some really useful stuff out there, but there are some difficulties with some of the material out there as well. So risk assessment has typically been embedded in the evidence base that we have about risk factors and protective factors. So we have a good sense of the evidence about kind of demographic groups who are more likely to perhaps contemplate suicide or act on their suicidal thoughts. So we know kind of differences across gender and across age and across occupational groups and across linking to particular kind of mental health experiences. The difficulty we have, of course, is that is the translation from the general to the specific. So, I might know that the risk factors say the people who identify as male or male who fall into the kind of 40 to 55-year-old age group who are in high stress occupations, maybe have experienced a relationship breakdown, maybe are using alcohol or drugs to cope with that difficulty, maybe have a sense of loss and difficulty, fall into a really high risk group. What that doesn't tell me is what the individual who might tick those boxes is likely to do in terms of themselves and their thinking, and they may be at no risk at all. And in fact, there was a study by Large et al. in 2016, an American study, who undertook quite a broad brush analysis of the risk assessment tools that are available, and reached a reasonably damning conclusion of them, is that they generally don't do what we hope they're going to do. And actually 95% of people who are identified as high risk don't end their life through suicide. So we have this kind of statistical mismatch, really. So my position has been for many years that the risk assessment is useful in itself, because those demographic factors, the research factors, links to trauma, childhood adverse experiences, so on and so forth, are really important to know that they might be significant for that person in terms of their suicidal thinking. But actually, what I learned as a Samaritans volunteer, which wasn't a risk assessment tool, it was a listening service, is a listening service. Way back when I was 19, when I volunteered, was actually the sense making happens in the relationship. So as a practitioner, of course, I hold all that knowledge and all the protective factors too. The fact that we're talking, they're coming to therapy, maybe they're on some medication, maybe they're seeing their medical practitioner. These are protective factors. They may have informal support sectors too. But the sense I make of that individual's risk can only be achieved by having the dialogue with the individual. So rather than the notion of risk assessment, I've argued further that it's a notion of risk exploration. So it has to be a collaborative endeavor. Now, if the person you're working with isn't able to enter into a collaborative dialogue about that, perhaps because their level of distress is such that they're no longer have the capacity to engage with you, then that might, of course, signal a different course of action where different sorts of interventions are needed. But assuming that isn't the case, then my experience has been the more we talk openly and transparently to our clients about their suicidal thoughts, not in metaphor and not hinting at, but very directly and clearly, we can begin to help make much more sense collaboratively with our client or patient about the risk that they present. Just to add a little bit on to that, in the UK, we have an organisation called the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, Health and Care Excellence, called NICE. And their job across the physical medicine and also mental health medicine is to review evidence. They review evidence and they offer treatment guidelines. And in September 2022, they issued their brand new treatment guidelines around what they call treatment guidelines for self-harm, which for them also includes suicide. And they have made a series of unequivocal statements that we must not use risk assessment tools to assess risk. We must not use risk assessment tools to determine who is offered treatment and who is discharged from treatment. We should not use risk assessment tools to determine levels of risk, but we should, they term it in terms of case formulation, which is language that's very familiar to us, which if we unpack that a bit more, it's about a dialogue, a collaborative dialogue where myself and my client, or my clients if I'm working with couples or indeed with groups, begin to formulate what does this mean to you? What's the sense of this for you? What makes this worse for you? What makes this better for you? How can you keep yourself safe? What actions can you take to keep yourself safe? And I think that's a much more pertinent and engaged way of kind of making sense of somebody's individual experience that's informed by the top level evidence, but goes well beyond it.
And you spoke earlier about, therapists or clinicians having the confidence to really, not beat around the bush, to really sort of have their own sense of what they're feeling in the room, but also what they're listening and what they're hearing. Do you want to say a little bit more perhaps about therapists and clinicians working in private practice, how one goes about developing that confidence? Because as you say, not everyone is working with a trauma or sort of more complex individuals at this time. So how would one start off maybe gaining that confidence? Or
yeah, for sure. Well, for a start, I hope attending conferences like this helps give them confidence, because I think we have to demystify kind of this type of work. And I think what this conference and other conferences do is have the dialogue about suicide. And I think it's interesting, the extent of suicide risk that we see in practice and including private practice, and as a profession, how comparatively little we still talk about suicide. So I think this conference is an enormous contribution to that, and more of it, I say. Specifically, I mean, you know, I've undertaken my own research in the UK again. I'm a UK-based practitioner, so not all of this may be transferable, so I won't go on it too long. But I did an audit of UK-based trainings for counselling and psychotherapy, and how equipped practitioners were to have the confidence to work with suicide. And the outcome of that was that they're not in any meaningful way. So the ethics of risk, the contract management of risk is talked about, but most of the therapeutic dialogue stuff is kind of left to the supervision.
Yeah.
When we go out as trainees to talk about our supervisors, which of course begs the question, where do supervisors get their confidence and competence from to talk about risk, other than just having worked for a longer period of time? Because it isn't always in the supervisor training either. So there is this kind of general training deficit, I would argue, around working with risk. So practitioners are coming out working with risk, but they don't have the confidence to name it. And I've been training practitioners, probably 20, 30,000 mental health practitioners over the years, and it's a common theme. We didn't really cover this in our training. We've not really had an opportunity, and many people come along and say, I've come because I just want to talk about this, because nobody else seems to be willing to talk about this. So I think we parallel something in the profession that we can also do in the consulting room, with our clients and with our patients, in that it becomes kind of unspeakable, becomes hard to talk about. There are myths around working with suicide. If I ask somebody about suicide, there's a chance that I might prompt their suicide. I might put the thought into their mind where it didn't exist before, and there's no research evidence to support that. If you ask in an empathic, in kind of an informed, clear, direct, but supportive and therapeutic way, your client or clients around suicide, you'll get one of three answers. What you won't get are the clients saying, oh, I can't possibly continue with this therapy because that's the most terrible question you've asked me. I've never had that experience at all. You'll get people who are saying, no, I don't have those feelings or thoughts, and I never have done, because they don't, and they never have done. Or they'll say, yes, I do. Sometimes I do think about this. And of course, then you can explore what that means for them, and all the things that we said before. Or they'll say, no, I don't, because they mean, yes, I do, but they're not ready to tell you yet. But what you've communicated is that this is part of a human experience and an existential experience. And this is all right for us to talk about. So the best training I ever had on working with suicide risk was not in my social work training, and not in my therapy training, and not in my coaching training, but was in the 6 evenings I spent with the Samaritans again, who basically took the terror out of it, basically said, ask the question, just ask the question. You know, in therapy, we'll talk about all sorts of things. We will encourage our clients to explore some of the most intimate aspects of their life to help them make sense of their difficulty. And yet this seems to be a bit of a taboo. So what we need to do again, before we find ourselves in a consulting room with a client that we're concerned about, is have the dialogue in supervision or in our professional networks. You know, practice naming it, thinking about the language we would use, how the language would fit for the client we're working with. I supervise a lot of children and young people's therapy. You know, how do we frame that question for younger people, or indeed older people? How do we frame that question where there are cultural differences and you know, kind of different perceptions of worldview and where we sit in it? But the simple message is never not ask the question, always ask the question, and it'll be okay. And you're not going to prompt suicide where that risk didn't exist before.
Mm. Yeah, and I think, you rightly talk about, I don't know what it's like in all countries, but we do have fantastic training here through Samaritans and some other charities. And talk a little bit about, I know NICE guidelines has changed here in the UK. Unsure what it is in sort of Europe, Italy, France, Germany, or in the States. Talk a little bit like policies and procedures and risk assessment in organizations, because sometimes, in my clinic, if I'm supervising, I have these horror stories that came in. We did everything, all the boxes, all the forms, all the everything, and we still lost this client. So talk a little bit about maybe your, just with your experience, your views on pretty much what you've just said, ask the question, forget about all the tick boxes in this day and age that we have to submit.
Yeah, yeah. And that's often the case. The client who left my room and ended her life had been involved in psychiatric services for 30 years. She'd had all of the kind of psychotropic medication that you would imagine. She'd had electroconvulsive therapy. She'd had inpatient care, outpatient care. In fact, I was seeing her in a psychosocial outpatient service. I was the first psychotherapist ever to work with her in her 30-year mental health history. She'd had everything that the mental health service could make available to her. And sometimes some people will end their life through suicide because that is something they will ultimately decide to do. And as practitioners, we have to sit with the uncertainty of that despite our absolute best efforts and despite the best use of the research evidence, for all the tick boxes that we've completed, for all the questions that we've asked, for all the dialogues, for all the keep safe plans that we've done, that sadly some people will end their life through suicide. However, that doesn't mean to say that we have an inevitability there. And often people who move to a suicidal place do so because in that moment they cannot think of an alternative solution to the problem or problems that they're encountering. It's the only solution they can find. And I think one of the biggest things that we need to hold as practitioners is hope for our clients, hope that things might be different, hope that things that will change, hope that that tomorrow or next week or next month that things might begin to be different. But there is this a participant was described this to me is that but the terror of suicide still sits there in the room, the terror that I might get it wrong as a practitioner, the terror that this person might end their life through suicide, and we feel that individually, and we then feel that can be felt then institutionally and organizationally. So it can be felt at an organizational level. So anxious organizations tend to be those organizations who over policy, who over procedure around suicide, if there is such a phrase as over procedure. I'm sure you know what I mean, Tracy, but they do flow charts. If client says this, you do this, and if client says this, you do this, and they always fall apart because there's one thing that's very predictable about human beings is that they're notoriously unpredictable. So they never quite follow the flow charts, and organizations feel sometimes that the more they try and pin down the detail, the less likely a suicide is, because no organization wants to find itself in a situation where they're having to contend with the enormity of somebody's death through suicide. Paradoxically, I would argue that the slightly lighter touch we can bring to policies and procedures, perhaps more procedural guidance, then best equips our practitioners to work with more confidence. I think, again, there's a paralleling. The more anxious the organization is and the more they try to micro control the decision-making process, consciously or unconsciously, that's then picked up by practitioners who become immobilized with fear that they're going to get it wrong. Whereas I've worked with a lot of organizations in helping them to kind of revisit and reflect on their existing policies and procedures, and most of them have chosen to lighten it up and to just really loosen the holding, and that the organization will do its absolute best to support an individual who's suicidal. The organization will always try and work in collaboration with others, whether they be formal or informal networks. That we will always do our best, but actually we are working with, our practitioners are working with an uncertain situation, and we will draw on best practice and best evidence, and we will always have the dialogue, and we will record that dialogue appropriately as well. We will try and take steps to help the client be safe. We will respond in situations of crisis, but holding that philosophical premise that ultimately we can do everything we can. My hunch is that the client who I've written about before, I've called Isabel, that's clearly not her name, but Isabel, when she came to me in that session, I don't know this because Isabel's not here for me to ask, but I'm pretty certain that Isabel came to me in that session having already decided what she was going to do. Perhaps psychotherapy had enabled her to have the confidence to make an independent decision, which is a strange way of putting it. It's not a desirable outcome of psychotherapy, is it? The death of the client. But maybe for Isabel, she had decided what she was going to do. She was decided how she was going to do it. Maybe she came to see me that day to close something for herself. She left by saying, "Thank you, Andrew. I feel really good. Thank you so much." Maybe she was thanking me to help her gain a sense of her autonomy. And my hunch is there's probably nothing I could have done to prevent Isabel's death through suicide. I could, of course, had I known she was going to go home and enter life, I would, of course, offered her additional support, maybe inpatient support, maybe an admission to the mental health unit in which I was based, where we also had crisis beds. Maybe. But maybe that would have just deferred the point at which she made a decision. And I think we need organizationally, procedurally, at a policy level, at a practice level, at a relational level, at a dialogic level, we need to hold that uncertainty. And suicide remains a possibility all the time in our work. And if we can't tolerate that uncertainty, then maybe we can't work as psychotherapists, because psychotherapy is always about uncertainty, isn't it? Not just around suicide. It's about people's experience and subjective experience of their world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And let's sort of just move this conversation. I want to talk about sort of, adverse childhood experiences and trauma, and you sort of alluded to that earlier on in our interview. And really the high correlation, the statistics that, we know from people who've had really bad ACEs, there's been a lot of trauma. The statistics around suicidal ideation and suicide are much higher. With your sort of incredible amount of experience, is that sort of something that sort of speaks truth to the stats, or have you seen something different in your career?
No, I think from my own experience, I think it does speak to the stats. I think the stats are right. I think a lot of the stats are right. I think when we're lonely, when we've experienced significant loss, if we've been brought up in such a way to not be able to have the confidence to articulate our emotions, and so we have to sit and be in a certain way. If we've experienced significant trauma or trauma in our kind of formative years, if we have a greater access to means, so on and so forth. I think all of these stats actually have a lot of truth in them. I have no problem with the kind of validity of the stats. The difficulty is, as I was saying before, is the translation of the truth of the statistical analyses into the individual experience. And having worked extensively with people who have ACEs, who have experienced trauma, and also issues such as around neurodiversity and kind of discrimination and oppression, you know, our processing of that, our sense making of that at an individual level is so it's so personalized, is so individual in our kind of culture with a small c and a capital C, the systems that we live in. The I can experience somebody who and work with somebody who has experienced profound trauma, and maybe have had thoughts of suicide during their life, but actually are in a place where suicide isn't something they're contemplating, and yet the trauma is something they need to process. I've just recently worked with somebody who's experienced really significant trauma over a long period of time, who can think of a time when self-injury was a mechanism by which she was able to cope with the overwhelming feelings of that, and indeed thoughts of suicide. But now suicide is just not something that she will contemplate because of the people around her and the system that she now finds herself in, or the community she finds herself in. And then likewise, people who would have experienced perhaps a different type of trauma over a different kind of time scale, for whom that is really overwhelming. So I think it was Linars, Antoine Linars, who's a clinical psychologist based in Canada, wrote this really great book called Psychotherapy with Suicidal People, a person-centered approach. And he wasn't meaning person-centered in the way we might think of it as therapists, in terms of kind of Carl Rogers and person-centered theory. He was talking about a person-centered approach in that very literal meaning. And he used a metaphor in his writing around, you know, we desperately go in search for a bump on the head equivalent. You know, if there is one identifying characteristic or one commonality characteristic that we can identify in our clients that give us that kind of heads up that suicide is a likelihood. And ACEs is kind of one of those bumps on the head. Because it is correlated quite notably with suicide attempts and death through suicide. But actually, we go for the lump on the head, the bump on the head, because we're so anxious about the possibility of our client's suicide that we just wish that there was a really obvious indicator of its likelihood. And so ACE is a hugely important. Trauma generally is massively important, as are the other social statistics. And therefore, what we should be as practitioners is mindful of the potential for suicide, or if that client has suicidal thoughts, how those characteristics might have positioned them such where suicide becomes more of a possibility for them. But they won't predict whether a client is actually going to have suicidal ideation, move from a place of suicidal ideation to intent, or indeed act on their intent. We can only find out by the dialogue.
And we're in I think, a really fascinating time clinically. You know, we've got so many trauma modalities. We've got DBT, we've got TCBT, we've got EMDR, we've got sensory motor psychotherapy, we've got cognitive processing therapy, we've got them all. And some modalities talk about sort of, clients, patients have parts of the self, so seeing a suicide part, and other modalities that, it's just the person. Where do you go? Like, what's your sort of thinking around, how do we work with parts of the, of the person, or do we work with the whole person? Or say a little bit about sort of where do you sit, Andrew? What do you find?
Yeah. It's a good question, isn't it? It's hundreds and hundreds of different modalities. And when you said, we have them all, and I was thinking, oh, we probably don't. There's probably still lots more to come down the line yet. I mean, my own training has been quite integrative. I've had obviously a psychodynamic casework, social work training, psychodynamic informed training, person-centered training, lots of training in cognitive behavioral therapy, integrative. I would define my own practice as pluralistic. And the reason why I would define it as pluralistic, as written by Mick Cooper and John McLeod, they brought a book out in 2011 about pluralistic counselling psychotherapy. And I think they're working on a second edition now. For me, when I read that book, that was a game changer for me, because in the UK, I'd like to think the elsewhere it's not like this, but in the UK, we spend a lot of time arguing with each other about which modality is better than the other. And you know, we
This is why I set up the company.
Is that why you set up the company?
To bring
Such
everyone
heated
together and
debate.
the argument.
Yeah, my modality is better than yours, and you know, there's hundreds of thousands of pounds invested into demonstrating which modality is better than the other. The reason why I'm pluralistic is, in general terms, is because I think people need different things at different times, and the same people might need different things at different points of their treatment or their help. And in working with suicide risk, you know, all the modalities that you named, I think all have something really important to contribute, hugely important to contribute. And for some people, identifying suicide as part of an aspect of self, and so we work with that aspect of self, is really important. Where for the next person who walks through your room or indeed logs online, that just wouldn't make any sense at all. How people are positioned culturally, you know, again, small c and capital C, in terms of their community, their faith, their frame of the world, their worldview will shape what they need. Issues around gender and around age. I mean, I could go on. So, the reason why I describe myself as a pluralistic practitioner is because I'm not an expert in all 400, 500, 600 modalities that it is claimed are out there. If only my head was big enough to know all of that. But I'm expert in the things that I know and have done and have learnt, and indeed have learnt from my patients and learnt from my clients and the experience I've accrued over the years, and my colleagues, and indeed having conversations like this. And that agility in my thinking, I hope that as a pluralistic practitioner, what I will do is co-construct a therapy with my clients that is what they need at that particular point. So I will ask my clients, you know, where are you now, and what is it you need from me? What is it you need from this space? And I might offer some ways of working in that, and we'll try and inform and shape my client to kind of co-produce the therapy that we have, which is a kind of a version of integration. I know that, but it's not my integration that I take to the client. It's an integration that the client and I have dialogue around and formulate and evolve and review and change. And for me, that's a really effective way of working with suicide risk, because certainly thinking back to Isabel, there were times with Isabel we talked about suicide, and she needed a very different type of intervention from me, and other times that she needed something different. What I hold on to, which goes back to the risk exploration bit, is that we know from decades of psychotherapy research that, of course, modality is important, and of course, therapeutic technique is important, and of course, factors inside and outside of the relationship are important. But actually, it's the relationship per se that's critical, and that I might be really skilled in a particular technique or modality, but if I can't form a trusting relationship with my client, I might as well not have that skill at all. And actually, some of the most therapeutically beneficial experiences can often happen outside of therapy, much to our narcissistic disgust, that actually there may be people who are better doing than what we do, you know, families and friends and informal conversations. And so yeah, that kind of collaborative co-construction of a way of working recognizes that people's sense of their suicidality will vary from point to point, and they may need different things from me, and different modalities will have something to offer, but it's held within the relationship where they and I can really honestly go there and have those discussions.
In your experience, suicidal ideation, self-harm, suicidality, do you see that as once adaptive? So, for example, you mentioned some research, Schneiber, no, someone like that. And you said in your statement that I was reading, he said, you know, tell me where it hurts. And I thought, you know, that's kind of profound, because usually it is about that. Forget all the protection and everything, but just like really tell me where it hurts, because people try and cope, it seems, as a way. So once adaptive, now into session, I'm looking to kill myself, maladaptive, right? Do you have that view, or have you come to that view that some of these are in some ways adaptive, but obviously they're not? They're trying to numb the pain, stop the pain, etc., etc.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we talk, we talk about suicide, and in a sense, we've done that here today as well, as one entity, as one way of being, about thoughts of ending your life, and as we know, actually the risk that's presented in suicide can be multifaceted and can vary considerably. And one end of a continuum might be people who absolutely don't have thoughts of suicide, but then the crisis happens and they're propelled into the suicidal place as a reactive response to a thing that's happened in their lives in that moment. They struggle to know how best otherwise to cope with, and we see that. We can see that often in younger people who perhaps don't have that same affective control or that same emotional repertoire to draw on. That's a huge generalization because many young people do. But that kind of impulsive suicide, or indeed that punishing suicide, that I'm going to talk about suicide and wanting to kill myself to punish you or to control you even. We see that in relationships, through to the type of suicide perhaps we've been talking about, where people move to a suicidal place, perhaps through the first person I talked about because of very profound physical health problems, or because of a major trauma, or indeed Isabel, after many years of kind of help, they move to a suicidal place, and we have opportunities there, windows of opportunities as therapists, to be able to help them step back and reflect on that, and perhaps make different decisions maybe. And then right at the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have people for whom suicide is an ever-present thought. I mean, there've been many people over the years I've asked about suicide, and they've said, I feel suicide all the time. It's knowing that any point I can choose to end my life is the only mechanism by which I can live my life. And so we have to know that suicide is a multifaceted thing, and there's a range of different kind of frameworks. O'Connor's framework, for example, different kind of discourses of suicide and intrapersonal processings of suicide, which can be really helpful, I think, in shaping our kind of therapeutic interventions. But fundamentally, and I think this was the power of Schneidman's quote, which is the one you were referring to, which was, we can have our social statistics and genetic testing and family history and blood tests and spinal fluid tests, he says in the quote. But at that moment and at that point, the most important question to a suicidal person is, where do you hurt and how can I help you? And I think wherever we're at in terms of how the person is conceptualizing their relationship with suicide, or their living or dying, to be really willing as a therapist to sit alongside and to say, I'm here and I'm willing to make that connection with you. So you tell me, if as best you can, what's hurting, and what can I do, or what can we do to try and help you navigate that in a way that is going to be as least harmful for you and possibly empowering for you as possible.
Andrew Reeves, thank you so much for a wonderful interview, your insights and expertise, and we really look forward to having you at the conference coming up in November.
Thanks so much, Tracy. Really, really enjoyed it, and thank you for the invite again.